Today's daf is Chulin daf Kuf Yud Zayin, and we will begin from the Mishnah on the last line of daf Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis. So we know that not all parts of a kosher animal is kosher. There's the chelev, certain fats of the animal that are not kosher. The dam of a kosher animal is not kosher. The gitanosha is not kosher. The chelev and the dam are unique, that in addition to them being macholas asuros, they carry the oynesh chamor of karas. So if somebody eats chelev of a kosher animal, or if somebody eats dam of a kosher animal, if he does it b'mezid, he's chayiv karas. If he does it b'shoigig, like all chayvei krisos b'shoigig, he would have to bring a karban chatas. So chelev and dam of a kosher animal are similar in that they both are chayvei krisos and they both b'shoigig are chayvei chatas. Stating that, says the Mishnah, that although chelev and dam are very similar, they're not the same. Chomer b'chelev b'dam, v'chomer b'dam b'chelev. Chelev has a chumrah that dam doesn't have, and dam has a chumrah that chelev doesn't have. Chomer b'chelev, chelev has a chumrah shah chelev moyalim by. If somebody would have hana'ah, the shear of a shava pruta, of the chelev of a behemoth that's kachim, he would violate the Issa Me'ilah, which means if he did a b'shoigig, he would have to bring the special karban osham, the Asham Me'ilah is with the keren and the chaimish, etc. Additionally, the chayavin olav mishum pigol, the noiser v'tameh. The chelev of a behemoth that's kachim is subject to the laws of pigol, to the laws of noiser, and to the laws of tameh, which means that if you have a carbon that's pigol, where the halach is if somebody eats it, he's chayiv kares. Even if someone would eat the chelev, he would be chayiv kares. If you have a carbon that's noisar, if somebody eats the chelev, he'd be over the iser noisar. And if somebody's tamei and he eats the chelev of a carbon, the halach is he would be chayiv kares for that as well. Not shaking dam, as opposed to dam. By dam, there's no me'ilah, and dam is not subject to the laws of pigul noisar and tamei. What's the chumah that dam has over chelev? Shadam noig bebehemoth v'chaya. Dam is noig by behemoths and chayas. It's the oif. Bein tmei and bein torah, whether they're kosher animals or non-kosher animals. V'chelev ain't noig el behemoth torah b'vad. As opposed to chelev, which is only noig by behemoth torah. So again, even though chelev and dam are very similar, but they each have their own chumras over the other. Chelev has a chumrah that it's subject to the laws of me'ilah, pigol, noiser, tameh. These are real festa, kachim, sugyas. They all relate to the chelev of a carbon as opposed to dam. Dam has a chumrah, and that dam is noig by behemah, it's noig by a chaya, it's noig by an oif. It doesn't matter if it's a kosher behemah chayav oif. It doesn't matter if it's a non-kosher behemah chayav oif, as opposed to chelev, which is only noig by behemah, and even that only by a kosher behemah. Says the Gemara, the first chumrah that was mentioned in this Mishnah was a chumrah that chelev has over dam, and that is that there's me'ilah by chelev. And the Gemara's question, Minani Mili, is that it's mashma that the chelev of all karbanos are subject to the laws of Me'ilah, not only kachei kadashim. And the truth is that the Torah, when it talks about the halach of Me'ilah, the Torah refers to the kachim as kachei Hashem. And Chazal understood kachei Hashem to mean kachei kachim, stating that from the Mishnah it sounds like the laws of Me'ilah relate to all chelev, even the chelev of kachim kalim. Now kachim kalim is not kachei Hashem. Why not? So Rashi says, because Kachim Kalim is Mammon Bailamu, which sounds a little bit like Shitas Rabbi Yosef Aglili throughout Shas, who holds that Kachim Kalim is Mammon Bailam. But regardless, the Gemara's question is, how do you know that even Kachim Kalim, which is Mammon Bailam, it's not Kachei Hashem, has the halachos of Me'ilos, as the Gemara Amar Rabyanai. The Amar Rabbi goes, the pasuk says, Kashe Yuram Mishar Zevach Shlomim. The context is the Par Koyim Mashiach. That's the special par that the Kohen Gadol had to bring if he did an Avera B'Shoigig Shezdoinoi Kares. And the Torah says that he has to bring a par. And then the Torah says that when he brings this par, you take the chalavim, and there's a bunch of emurim that have to be burnt on the mizbeach, like every chatas, right? Some of it is eaten by the kohanim, and some of it had to be burnt on the mizbeach. And then the Torah says that you should be makted emurim kashiyuram mishar zevach hashlam. Just like you makted emurim of the shlomim, so too you should be makted emurim of the chatas. And the Gemara asks, madnu mishar zevach hashlam. What are we learning from the shlomim? What does the Torah mean when it says that be makted emurim of the par koyim Mashiach, just like you're being makted emurim of the Shar Zevach HaShlomim? If it's coming to tell me which Emurim is supposed to be makter, the Torah already said that. If you go through the pasuk says exactly what you're supposed to be makter, and then the Torah says, just like you makter the Emurim of the Shlomim, so too you should be makter the Emurim of the Chatas. What is that coming to be marba? to tell me which emurim the Torah already specified. Which emurim? Says the Gemara, even though the simple reading of the pasuk seems to be saying that Shlomim is teaching something to Parkoy Mashiach, really it's in the reverse. The reason the Torah mentioned Kasha Yura Mishar Zavach Shlomim is to teach me halacha regarding Shlomim. That there's something in Chatas that you would have thought does not relate to Shlomim, that does relate to Shlomim. What is that? Makishar Zavach Shlomim, the Parkoy Mashiach, Parkoy Mashiach Yesh Me'ilah, just like the Parkoy Mashiach has Me'ilah, because it's Kachi Kedashim, and Kachi Kedashim are for sure Kachi Hashem, are for sure subject to the halachas of Me'ilah. Afshar Zavach Shlomim Yesh by Me'ilah. So too, a carbon Shlomim, even though it's Kachim Kalim, still it's going to be subject to the halachas of Me'ilah. So the question was, Minan, immediately, how do you know that a Shlomim, which is Kachim Kalim, it's Chalavim, are subject to the halachas of Me'ilah? The Teretz says it's learned out from a pasuk in Parshas Vayikra that talks about the Parkoy Mashiach. The Torah relates the emurim of the Parkoy Mashiach to the emurim of the Shlomim, which really teaches me nothing. Must be Hareza Ba Lilamed V'nim Solamed. Instead of learning something about the Parkoy Mashiach from the Shlomim, we learned something about the Shlomim from the Parkoy Mashiach, specifically the Parkoy Mashiach is Kachi Kedashim, it's subject to the laws of Me'ilah. The Shlomim is going to be subject to the laws of Me'ilah as well. Amalei Reb Chanina. So Reb Chanina told Rabbi Yanai, very nice pshat, but Ku'ur is Shoshana Rebbe. Is there something wrong with the pshat that Rebbe said? It says in the Torah, Kol Chelav Hashem, and we learn from the Rabbi Semurim Kachim Kalim Me'ilah. Kol Chelav Hashem is extra, and it's coming to teach me even the emurim of Kachim Kalim. So what do you need this pasuk? Kashe Yura Mishar Zavach Shlomim Hareza Bol Olam V'nim Tzolami to tell me that Kachim Kalim, such as a Shlomim, is subject to the laws of Me'ilah. It's a Mefurisha Riboy in the parsha of Chalavim that says Kol Chelav Hashem, that even a Murei Kachim Kalim are subject to Me'ilah. Rabbi, it's because Rachmana Chelav. Had we only had that second drasha, I would have thought Chelav in Yisrael Shtei Klal Yisrael. I would have thought the Chalavim of Shlomim go on the Mizbeach, despite the are subject to Me'ilah, despite the fact that it's Kachim Kalim. But what about the Emurim that are not Chalavim? Meaning there were 4 chalavim that were included in the emurim that went on the mizbeach. But in addition to the 4 chalavim, there were other parts of the animal that also went on the mizbeach. For example, the yoseres, v'shtei hakloyos, the yoseres, which is the diaphragm, the shtei hakloyos, the 2 kidneys, which also went on the mizbeach. You can't be marba that from kol chelav Hashem. Kol chelav Hashem is being marba the chalavim of the shlomim that they're included in the halachas of Me'ilah. But what about the emurim that are not? That's why I need kashirim to tell me that all the emurim of the chatas apply to the shlomim as well, not only the chalav. Because Rachman Kashrim, I only had Kashrim Hava. I would have thought chelev alya, the lesser b'shar loy, the chelev of the alya, the chelev of the tail, which is not existent by the shar. I would have thought that being that it does not go on the mizbeach, so by the shlomim it shouldn't go on the mizbeach either. To tell me that even the chelev alya. So there's 2 drashas to teach me that the chalavim of the Shlomim of Kachim Kalim are subject to the halachas of Me'ilah. Why do I need both? So the Gemara is a tzrichasa. Why I need both? If I only had one, I wouldn't know the Yeseres and Shtei HaKavim. If I only had the other one, I would not know the Chelav Ha'alya. Between the 2, I know that all the emurim, whether it's the Chalavim, whether it's the Chelav of the Alya, whether it's the Yeseres and the Shtei HaKloyos, any part of the emurim of the carbon shlomim are subject to the laws of Me'ilah. Amalei Ramari the Rab Zvid says the Gemara, if you're telling me that kol chelav Hashem is coming to be marba the chelav of the alya, that's what the Gemara came out in the cheshbon. So if that's the case, then the chelav of the alya, the chelav of the tail, should be included in the isser chelav as well, which says that if somebody eats chelav, certain chalavim, he's chayiv kares, and we know that you're allowed to eat the chelav of the alya. Amalei. So he told him, the answer is, it says called chelav shar v'chesed ve'ez. Davar hashav v'shar v'chesed ve'ez. The only type of chelav that is aser is chelav that the shar, the kesef, and the ez all have. I mean that the chelav ha'alya is only by the kesef, you don't have it by the shar and the ez. That's why, even though we're being marba chelav ha'alya to the halachas of Me'ilah and to the halachas of Aktara, but at the same time, as it relates to the Isra Chelav, they're not going to be included. Rashi said a different teretz, Chelboy ha'alya ikri, Chelav stamaloy ikri. Chelav ha'alya is called Chelav, but it's called Chelav ha'alya. it has the surname, Chelav Alya. It's not called Stam Chelav. When the Torah talks about the Isser Chelav, the Torah talks about Stam Chelav, and Chelav Alya is not called Stam Chelav. That doesn't make sense. Because if you're telling me that Chelav Alya can't be included in the Isser Chelav, because it's called Chelav Alya and it's not called Chelav, then how are you being marba it from the pasuk that says Kol Chelav Lashem? Kol Chelav Lashem is also Stam Chelav. So, if you can't be marba Chelav Alya to the Isser Chelav, then how could you be marba Chelav Alya to the pasuk that says Kol Chelav Lashem to tell me that there's going to be an Isser Me'ilah by the Chelav Alya of Kachim? Kalim El Machvaitik Reb Zvid must be. You have to say the teretz is like Reb Zvid. Either way, that concludes the first part of the daf. So again, the Mishnah was discussing the differences between Chelav and Dam. Chelav and Dam are very similar. They're both parts of a kosher animal that you're not allowed to eat. You have to do nikur to remove the Chelav. You have to do melicha to remove the Dam. They both carry a harsh punishment of kares, b'shoigeg. If you would eat either one of them, you'd have to bring a carbon chatas. That's why throughout Shas you find the chatas chelev and the chatas dam, chatas hayris, etc. Stating that chaymer b'chelev b'dam, the chaymer b'dam b'chelev. The first chumrah that chelev had over dam is me'ilah. It sounded like that all karbanos, every carbon, whether it's kachim kadashim or whether it's kachim kalim, whether it's kachim kadashim, which is kachay Hashem, or whether it's kachim kalim, which according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili is mama vaylam. If somebody would have anah shava pruta, he would be subject to the laws of Me'ilah. L'chayre, how do you know that the Emurim, the Chelev of Kachim Kalim have Me'ilah? At the end of the day, it boils down to two drashes. One is a pasuk of Parshas Vayikra, where the Torah talks about the Parkoy Mashiach. The Torah says, take all the Emurim, be makdir on the Mizbech, and then it says, Kashayura Mishar Zavach Hashlami, which is teaching me nothing. Must be Areza Bolo Lame V'nim Tzolame, that just like the chalavim of the Parkoy Mashiach are kachi kadashim and are subject to the Me'ilah, so too the chalavim of the Shar Zavach Hashem are subject to Me'ilah as well. Additionally, we have a pasuk of Kol Chelav Lashem, l'rabbis, not only the chalavim of kachi kadashim, but even to be marba the chalav of kachim kalam. What do you need two drashas for? So the Gemara gave it strichas for that. Either way, so the Mishnah said that chaymer b'chelev b'dam, that chelev has Me'ilah, that we just discussed, the chayav and all mishum pigol v'noisiv v'tameh, and the subject to the laws of pigol noisiv v'tameh, mashe'en came b'dam. How do you know that dam is not subject to the laws of Me'ilah? How do you know that dam is not subject to the halachas of pigol noisiv v'tameh? So first Me'ilah, Amar Ula said, Amar the pasuk says, Shelochem. It says, Ki nefesh habasar badamhi. Vanina tzatev lachem al hamizbech lechaper al nafshay seichem ki adam hu banefesh yichaper. That's a real kachim pasuk. The Gemara learns Rika Shalebim Koimai from this pasuk. Zvachim Daf Chavav. So there's festa sugyas that come out of this pasuk. But for now, what we need is the pasuk refers to the dam of a carbon and says Vanina tzatev lachem al hamizbech. What does lachem mean? It's yours. Shalochem yehei. It's yours. Meaning there's no isim me'ilah. That if you would have hana from the dam, you wouldn't be over to the typical halacha me'ilah, which you would have if you'd be nena from kachim. It says lechaper, lechaper nesatev lo me'ilah. That this is something that his tachlis is kapara, and it's only with regards to kapara that it has kedusha. That's the beer in the drasha. But as it relates to me'ilah, it doesn't have kedusha. The whole kedusha is manifest as it relates to being mechaper. But as it relates to anything else, even me'ilah, who lifnei kapara kala acha kapara. It says ki adam hu banefesh yichaper. Who means it's always the same. Who achashverish. He was a Russian betchilav atzayv, the Gemara says, right? So who lifnei kapar kalacha kapar malacha kapar eba milo. Just like after you do this rika, if somebody would have enough from the dam, he wouldn't be moil. Af lifnei kapar eba milo. So too, if somebody would have enough from the dam before he did this rika, there wouldn't be miilo either. Says the Gemara, ve'ema hu lacha kapar lifnei kapar mechatesi. Why don't you say that dam is no different than any other part of the carbon? Therefore, it's subject to the laws of mila. Ayat says who? Maybe who in the reverse? Ma lifnei kapar yesh b'milo, af lacha kapara. Meaning you're assuming for sure la'acha kapara there's no me'ilah. Thus, if you have who, if there's no me'ilah la'acha kapara, there can't be me'ilah lifnei kapara either. Because who means it's consistent. Well, how do you know? How do you know for sure that there's no me'ilah la'acha kapara? Maybe there is me'ilah la'acha kapara, and if that's the case, maybe dam has me'ilah lifnei kapara, and it's consistently that way. Because even la'acha kapara it has. The Gemara says that can't be because ein l'chadavar shenasa mitzvasa yumayilum. Because there's a principle in kachim that says that any chelik of a carbon, anything that's hektish, that is hektish for a purpose, and you fulfill the purpose with it, it loses its kedusha at that point. Or at the very least, it loses its kedusha as relates to me'ilah. So Eilecha Dover Shenase Mitzvasai Umayel. So a carbon's tachlis is to be brought in the Mizbeach. Once it's brought in the Mizbeach, it loses its kedusha from the me'ilah perspective. You can't be moyel in kachim after it was already Nasis Mitzvasai. So Dam La'achas Rikos Nasis Mitzvasai. So me that it's Nasis Mitzvasai, it's Pasha, there's no me'ilah. Who tells me that Dam has to be consistent? Whatever Dam is, La'acha Kapar, it has to be Lifnei Kapar. If La'acha Kapar, for sure, there's no me'ilah, then Lifnei Kapar, there's not going to be me'ilah. You're afraid to tomorrow for loy, but is that true? Is what true? That Eilecha Dover Shenase Mitzvasai Umayel Boy. So the Gemara is going to digress for a little bit. Chumas Hadeshen, the Nase Mitzvasai Umayel Boy. Chumas Hadeshen, you find that even after you do the mitzvah of Chumas Hadeshen, still there's me'ilah on the Deshen itself. So what was Chumas Hadeshen? That was the first avodah that was done every single day in the Beis Hamikdash. Kohen would go up the ramp, they'd make a goyrel, who should do the Chumas Hadeshen. He'd go up, he would take it's like a scoop full of dashen and put it next to the mizbech. He wouldn't remove all the dashen; that would be a big job. But he'd take a little bit of dashen and he'd put it next to the mizbech. And Chazal say that the Torah says v'samay eitzel hamizbech. That was yesterday's kriya, and we learn from there mishum dahavoy. And we learn from there the sign that has to remain there. Remain there meaning you can't benefit from it personally. Mechura, there's an isamilo. So you see that even though you did the mitzvah of Chumas Hadeshen, still it could be a problem. So mechatesi, we're assuming this yisoid that Eilecha Dover Shenasis Mitzvasai Umayel Boy. What about Chumas Hadeshen? So the Gemara, it's true, but mishum da'avoy Chumas Hadeshen ubig deikuna shnei ksuvim abon ke'echad v'chol shnei ksuvim abon ke'echad ein melamdin. It's true that Chumas Hadeshen is an example of a Dover Shenasis Mitzvasai where you find milah. But the problem is that there's another place in the Torah where you also find the Davar Shenasis Mitzvasai Umayel Boy, and counterintuitively, if the Torah tells you something twice, it means you can't learn anything from it. And usually, if the Torah says something, you can learn from it. It's one of the Yud Gimel Midah Shatar and Adreshes Bam. It's called Binyanav, Mamatzinu. But if the Torah says something 2 times, then you have the halach of Kol Shnei Ksuvim Haban Ke'echad Ema. What's the second time? The second time is regarding the big day love that the Kohen Gadol used to wear in Yom Kippur. So the Kohen Gadol couldn't enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim with the big days of. Ein Kateger Nasas HaNeger. Shouldn't remind the Kodesh Baruch Hu Kaviyachol of the Chet HaEgel. So therefore, before he entered the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he removed the big days of, and he entered with the big day love. What happened to the big day love after Yom Kippur? So the pasuk says Ve'nicham Sham, and there's machlokes in Shas whether Ve'nicham Sham means it had to be left there forever, nobody was ever allowed to benefit from it, or Ve'nicham Sham just means that the Kohen Gadol himself couldn't use it for the next Yom Kippur, couldn't wear the same kittel, the same big day lovin that he wore the previous year. But if a Kohen Head wanted to use it, he could use it. So it says the Gemara, according to the Manama, that holds that no one was ever allowed to use the big day lovin once the Kohen Gadol wore it. V'nicham Sham means it's going to be there forever. No one can ever use it. So if that's the case, you see, they have a davar shenasis mitzvah, so you might. And if that's the case, you have shnei ksuvim babon kechad, because you have chumas hadeshen, which is a davar shenasis mitzvah, and now you have the big day kuna, the big day lovin of Yom Kippur, which is a davar shenasis mitzvah, the chol shnei ksuvim babon kechad ein melamdim. But the Gemara says, "Hanich the Rabbanan, that's only good according to Rabbanan. Then no one's ever allowed to wear it again. That it's only the Kohen Gadol himself that's not allowed to wear it again. But if a Kohen Head wants to wear it, he can. Then vice versa, there's no Issa Me'ilah, because if there was an Issa Me'ilah, the Kohen Head wouldn't need to be able to wear it. So it's not pshat to davar shenasis mitzvah that now has an Isser Hana. There is no Isser Hana. It's just a Kohen Gadol. It's a din that he can't wear it a second time. Ma'yikil Meimer, meaning it's only one Makar that davar shenasis mitzvah is Ma'ilum. And if that's the case, say Binyanav. Why don't we learn from there that a davar shenasis mitzvah is? Says the Gemara, Mishum Da'avoy Chumas Hadeshen Egla Rufa Shnei Ksuvim Abon Ke'echad. Hol Shnei Ksuvim Abon Ke'echad Lam. Says the Gemara because it's another pasuk, and that is Egla Rufa. Egla Harufa was also Aser V'Hana, meaning the Egel itself, after the process of beheading the Egel was done, the Torah says you can't have Hana from the Egel or from the Nachal. Everything is off limits. It doesn't make sense. If there's a principle of Davar Shenasis Mitzvah so why is there an Isser Hana with the Egla Arufa after the Arifa of the Egel already took place? Now, is there an Issa Me'ilah? It really depends whether Egla Arufa is Kachim or it's not Kachim. We spoke about this. But the point is, for now, for sure there's an Issa Hana. So you see a concept of a Davar Shenasis Mitzvah and quote unquote, Mayalim Boy. So weiter it's Shnei Ksuvim Abanke Echad. I mean that Shnei Ksuvim Abanke Echad, you can't learn from there. Now the Gemara asks, the Kasha always asks when it mentions Shnei Ksuvim Abanke Echad Ein Malamden. That's all good according to the Mandam of the old. Shnei Ksuvim Abanke Echad Ein Malamden. El Mandam of Malamden. But according to the Mandam that says Shnei Ksuvim Abanke Echad Malamden. Ma'yikal Meimer. Again, what's the Kasha? Why is it so pashut that a Dovish and Asas Mitzvah say Ein Mayalim Boy? L'chayra, I have two parashiyas in the Torah where you find a Dovish and Asas Mitzvah say Umayalim Boy. Trumas Hadeshen. After the Kohen did the mitzvah with the Trumas Hadeshen, the Torah says V'sama Yitzlam is Bech. You can't touch it. You can't have enough from it. And then you see it again by the Egla Arufa, or maybe you see it by the Kohen Hedya. But the point is that if you hold Shnei Ksuvim Abanke Echad Malamden, so learn from these two parashiyos that even a Dovish and Asas Mitzvah says Mayalim Boy. The Gemara says Shriya Miyutik Sivi. The reason is because he can't learn from any one of these parashiyos. Why? As it relates to Trumas Hadeshen, it says V'samai is a miyut. Only here you have this halacha. Ordinarily not. Which halacha do you only have here? That even though it's nasis mitzvah, so still is in this around, still is going to be in this amila. But as it relates to anywhere else in Kachim, Davish and nasis mitzvah, say the rule is ein mailam by. And Hasam by the Egla Arufa, ksiv ha'arufa. I mean that it says over there ha'arufa. It's for that reason that over there you're going to have that same halacha as well. Either way, says the Gemara, we have three psukim l'chayra to teach me the halacha that there's no me'ilah by dam. The question was, why is there no me'ilah by dam? If you can't be moyo in hektish, dam, there's nothing more hektish than dam in a way. Dam is the mechaper, dam is the meratzav, right? When you learn Masechtes Zvachim, it's all about the dam. Everything else is the nimsh, is a mashal. The nimshal is the dam, right? Everything is a tuffle to the dam. The dam is the mechaper, it's the avodas adam. That's the ikr. So if that's the case, how's it possible that there's no me'ilah when it comes to dam? And the Gemara said three mekayros. Ula said that the Torah says, "Vanina satif lochem ala mizbech." Oh, you see, the dam is lochem. Lochem. I have a shaykhis to it. I can benefit from it. Devei Rabbi Shmuel's yeshiva, they said it says lechaper and satif lo'ivadavarach. That it's true that dam has kedusha, but only for kapara, not for mi'ilah. And finally, Rabbi Yochanan said it says who lifnei kapara, kalacha kapara, and mala acha kapara. It's pashut that there's no me'ilah, because then it's going to be a davish and asas mitzvah. And any davish and asas mitzvah, ein mo'ilim by. What do you mean? Trumas Hadeshen, egla rufa, big dekuna. So the Gemara addressed that. But the bottom line is those are exceptions to the rule. As it relates to the rule is davish and asas mitzvah, ein mo'ilim by. And who means it has to be consistent. It means lifnei kapara also. It's going to be in a way where there's no me'ilah. But the Gemara's taina now is v'tlasa kro'i lamali. Meaning all three drashas seem to be very solid. You have Ula, you have the Devei Rabbi Yishmael, and you have Rabbi Yochanan. So Pashat has three pshatim, three different sources in the Torah to tell me how I know that there's no Me'ilah. But the Gemara is bothered by that. The Gemara thinks that L'chayra, Ula, Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yochanan all acknowledged the other drashas, and if that's the case, why do we need three drashas? And with that, the Gemara is going to conclude its discussion. So the Gemara, chad l'mu'ute minoisa, v'chad l'mu'ute mimila, v'chad l'mu'ute mitoma. You're right. I don't need three drashas just for me'ilah. So what do I do with the other two? I learned the other halachas of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that there's four critical sugyas and halachas and kachim that don't relate to the dam. You don't have me'ilah, you don't have pigul, you don't have noiser, and you don't have tameh. Now that I have three drashas, we thought all three were coming to explain what? No, we can reconcile it, and we can say that the three relate to the three halachas of the Mishnah. One is coming to tell me that there's no me'ilah, one's coming to tell me there's no nicer, and the other one's coming to tell me there's no tumah. What's the problem? The problem is the Mishnah said four halachas. The Mishnah said me'ilah, pigul, nicer, and tameh, and all you have is three drashas. So how do you know that there's no pigul when it comes to them? Zok the Gemara, this is Kachim 101. Avo mi pigul loy tzarich kradet. Now because it's a Mishnah. Kol sheyesh l'matir and bein l'adam bein l'mazbech yavan al mishum pigul. V'dam gufei mater. We know that pigul is all about mater and nitter. The sifkaton in that idea that we need for this line in Gemara is that the only part of a carbon that's subject to the halachas of pigul, meaning if someone would eat from that part of a carbon pigul would be chayiv kares, is only a part of a carbon that's nitter. It needed something to be materit. So for example, the basar of a carbon needs something to be materit ba'achila. What's materit ba'achila? The dam. The shchita kabbalah ilacha zrika is matter the basar b'achila. Thus, the basar is a davar sheyesh le matirin, so to speak. It's something that has something being matter it, and as a result, it's subject to the laws of pigul. The emurim have something that's matter. The emurim are not allowed to go on the mizbeach until you do this rika. So there too, it's the avodas hadam that I'm matter the emurim on the mizbeach. So any chelik of a carbon that needs something to be matter it, the shiarei hamincha, the koimetz is matter. So anything that has something being matter it, that has a halacha. The shtei alechem has something being matter. The kifsei atzeres, I'm matter the shtei alechem, etc., etc. The point is that nothing's matter the dam. The dam doesn't need an avodah to be matter it to eat. You don't need it to go on the mizbeach. Doesn't need anything to be matter it to go on the mizbeach. As a result, it's a davar she'in le matirim, and a davar she'in le matirim is not subject to the laws of pit. I'll need a drasha for that. That's Pasha, that's Zvachim 101. So I have a drasha for the fact that there's no me'iva by dam, the fact that there's no noisa, there's no tumah, as it relates to pigul. I don't need a drasha. And on that note, Hadron Alach kol ha-basa. So the Gemara now is going to make one of the great digressions of all time, and we're going to turn our attention from the sugyas of taruva, of basa v'chalav, the sugyas of issa v'heter, bittul v'shishin, min b'minay, bin b'she'enay minay. I mean, if you want to look at the broader context of Masechtas Chulin, we're learning about shchita and treifus and oisei v'esbenai and behema makasha and kisei adam. What are we going to learn about now? The next 12 or so dafin are going to be hardcore sugyas with regards to tumah for tahira. Either way, it's up to Mishnah. Ha'or v'haroitev. Actually, a little bit of an introduction. And that is, so we're familiar with the basic concept of tumah v'tahira, and to the extent we're not, we'll become a lot more familiar with it over the next 2 or so weeks. But just as a hakdama to this Mishnah, we know that food can become tameh. Food could also transmit tumah. It's what's known as tumas oichlin. In order for food to become tameh or to transmit tumah, it has to be a proper shear. The shear of oichlin, as it relates to tumah, is a kebeya. It's halacha l'moshe misinai, shiurim halacha l'moshe misinai. Even though shiurei achila is usually bekazayis, but as it relates to tumas oichlin, the shear is kebeya. A nevela also has tumah. A nevela is actually a tumah chamura in a sense, in that it's a source of tumah. Right? There are different sources of tumah. A mace is a source of tumah. A sheretz is a source of tumah. A zava, a nida, a yeledes. These are all avos hatumah. They're sources of tumah. Nevela is tameh. Nevela is asa b'achila. Nevela is also tameh. That's one of the big differences between a nevela and a treifa. A nevela and a treifa are both asa b'achila. They're both chayvilavin. The significant difference between nevela and treifa is that in addition to a nevela being asa b'achila, it's also tameh. So you learn about nevelas when you learn Masechtas Chulin. You also learn a lot about nevela when you go through sugis of tumah v'tahira, because nevela is something that really straddles two worlds. It straddles the worlds of nachalei sasurais and of tumah v'tahira, as opposed to a treifa. A treifa had a kosher shchita in the sense that it was metahirit midei nevela. It's the loss of akila. There's an issa treifa. But as it relates to tumah, there's no tumah. But the point is that nevela has tumah. What's the shear nevela as it relates to tumah? Kizayas. So the shear tumas oichlin is b'kebeya. The shear tumas nevela is b'kizayas. The halacha that the first sugi is over here in Perek ha'or v'haroitev is going to discuss is, what if you have food that has something attached to it, something naturally attached to it. So, for example, the pit of fruit. So, the pit, is it part of the fruit or is it not part of the fruit? As it relates to the halachas of tumah v'tahira. And really, you have to look at it from three perspectives. Is it part of the fruit? Is it mitzvah to the shear? Tumas oichlin is b'kebeya. It says mitzvah to the shear beya. Number two, what happens if the pit touches a davar tameh? Does the fruit now become tameh? If it's part of the fruit touched the davar tameh. If it's not part of the fruit, then the fruit did not touch a davar tameh. What if the fruit was tameh and the pit of the tameh fruit touched something that was tar? Does that davar tar now become tameh? Did it come in contact with a davar tameh? Depends. If the pit is part of the fruit, then it came in contact with a davar tameh. If it's not part, then it did become part of the. That's one thing that's going to be discussed. Another thing that's going to be discussed is, what about the peel? What about the peel of a fruit? Or let's say the skin of basar, the skin of an avela, for that matter, the or. So how do you look at the or? Do you look at the or as being part of the basar, or do you not look at it part of the basar? Again, three nafkaminas as relates to the shear, as it relates to if the basar was tahar, and now the or came in contact with a davar tameh, does it now become tameh? Or in the reverse, if the basar was tameh and a davar tar came in contact with the would it be tameh or not? What about the hear? Let's say there's a little fuzz on the fruit, but let's say the hear of the of an avela. How does that relate as it relates to halacha? As we'll see, there are three categories when you talk about things that are attached to oichel. The first, such as a pit, is what's referred to as a yad. The yad is something that's used just to be able to handle the fruit. So a pit is part of the fruit in the sense that you can carry the fruit by holding, not the pit, by the stem. I keep saying the pit. It's the stem. You can carry the fruit by holding onto the stem. It's considered a yad. The of basa, for example, is considered part of it because it's a shomer, meaning it's a yad. You can carry, obviously, the basa by holding the but it's also a shomer in the sense that it protects it. And then something like here is not really a yad, it doesn't really protect it. So it's really going to be three categories when you talk about things that are mechuber to oichel with regards to the three nafkaminas that we just mentioned. So you have to look at what that thing is. Does it fall into the category of yad? It's merely something that's there for convenience purposes to help you handle it. Is it a shomer? It's protecting it, like the peel, like the skin? Or is it none of the above? Regardless, on that note, it's like the Mishnah. The of a behema, the haroitev, we know what that is. The akipa, that's the little bit of basar that falls to the bottom of the pot. The Gemara is going to discuss what olol is. V'hatsamois, and the bones. V'hagidin, v'hakronayim, the horns. V'hatlofayim, and the hooves. Mitztarfin l'tamei tumas oichlin, avaloi tumas nevelas. So if you have an oichel and you want to know whether this oichel has tumas oichlin, you want to know if it has a sheer beya. So the and the roitiv and the kippah and the olol and the atzomes and the gidin kronayim klafayim are all mitztarf to the tumas oichlin. Avaloi tumas nevelas. But if you want to know if you have the shir kezayis for tumas nevelas, the halach is it's not mitzdarf. Another difference between tumas oichlin and tumas nevelas is if somebody shechts a behemoth meya and he does it leivik echavim umefarcheses and it's still alive, the halach is metame tumas oichlin. It's going to be tummy tumas oichlin. Avaloi tumas nevelas. The Gemara is going to discuss this. Acha tumas or yachiyatis is roisha. There's no tumas nevelas until it actually dies. If it's mefarcheses, there'll be tumas oichlin but not tumas nevelas. Riba letame tumas oichlin mimash riba letame tumas nevelas. And what you see from these two cases mentioned in the Mishnah is that it's easier for something to become Tomei Tumas Eichlin than it is Tumas Nevelis. The first is you see all the things mentioned in the Mishnah, the Roitiv, etc., are mitzdarif to the Shir Tumas Eichlin, they're not mitzdarif to the Shir Tumas Nevelis. And then the second halacha, which we don't know what that means now, you see also it relates to Tumas Eichlin, not to Tumas Nevelis. The point is, that's what we need for now, is Riba Letame Tumas Eichlin, Mimasha Riba Letame Tumas Nevelis. Another halacha, Rabbi Yehuda says, as it relates to the Olol, which Rashi says, Mefarish B'Gemara, Ha'olol HaMechunis, if it's gathered together, then it's possible that you will be chayv. Again, everything will be discussed in the Gemara. But the first halacha of the Mishnah, which is going to be the topic of the beginning of the parak, and that is ha'or, the haroite, the hakipa, the olol, that is the gidin, the kranayim, the tlafayim. They're all mitzdarif for the shir tumas oichlin. So if you have oichel and there's or attached to it, or this kippah that was cooked with it and now it's on it, or the horns, the hooves of the so you want to know if you have the shir beya for tumas oichlin, they're mitzdarif. But if you want to know if you have the shir kizayis for tumas nevela, that is not mitzdarif. So the Gemara tanina lo the Tanur Rabbanan. This Mishnah supports something that's before in a brayso. What does it say in a brayso? Shoymrim l'tuma kala v'lo shoymrim l'tuma chamura. Something that's a shomer of oichel is mitzdarif for the shir of tuma kala. Tumas oichlin is considered tuma kala, but it's not mitzdarif for tuma chamura. It's not mitzdarif to the shir kizayis of nevela, which is considered a tuma chamura. And incidentally, why is oichel considered a tuma kala, and why is nevela considered a tuma chamura? So the easy answer is because nevela is a source of tuma. It's a tuma chamura. A nevela is like a nida. It's a source of tuma. It's like a v'tzaira. It's like a mace. A nevela, that's what it is. A dead animal. It's like a mace. The point is that it's a source of tuma. Oichel is never a source of tuma. How does food become tuma? How does an apple become tuma? It would come in contact with a davar tuma. So it would have to be wet first, masachtas machshir, and then afterwards it would become tuma. But either way, so nevela is a tuma chamura. Oichlin in general is a tuma kala. You see from our mission that the shomer is mitzdarif for tuma kala. It's not mitzdarif for the tuma chamura. Now, which parts of the Mishnah are considered shomerim? So the Rishonim say there are two things in the Mishnah. The oir is a shomer, the skin protects the food, and the atzamos are considered shoyrim as well. So from the fact that the and the atzamos are mitzaref for tumas oichlin, but they're not mitzaref for tumas nevela. So you see, shoyrim are mitzaref for tumah kala, shoyrim are not mitzaref for tumah chamur. Zog to Rabbi, how do you know that? The Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, al kol zera zeru v'chiyipam in the v'losim al kol zera zerua asher yizareya tarhu. So the pasuk sounds a little wordy. It is, and Chazal were bothered by it, right? V'chiyipam in the v'losim al kol zera zerua asher yizareya. Zera zerua means on something that grows. Asher yizareya. What does Asher yizareya coming to teach me? Now this pasuk says tarhu. How's that possible? V'chiyipam in the v'losim. The context are the shmoyne shratzim that are tameh when they're dead. So the nevela of one of the Shemona Shratzim fell on Zera Zerua, Asher Yizareya, Taharu. How's it possible that it's going to be tar? So what's the answer? Or wet. It's Mesachtes Machshir. But in order for food to become tameh, it has to first be wet. The Bailam has to be okay with it. So he has to be okay with it. But the point is that if it wasn't wet, then the halacha is taru. But either way, Chazal were bothered with the wordiness of this pasuk. Kol zera zerua asher yizareya. Say Chazal kederech shebnei adam meitzim l'zriya. You know what's coming to tell me? It's coming to tell me that when you look at the food from a tumah and tahira perspective, as this pasuk is discussing, you look at the food in the way that it's sowed, in the way that it's planted, in the way that it's put in the ground. And if you're planting a chita, you'll do it bikli pasa, together with its husk. Usaira bikli pasa, va'adashim bikli pasa. Meaning, when you eat a chita, you remove its husk, then you're going to eat it. You're not going to eat it together with the klipa. You're not going to eat the saira and the adashim together with its klipa. But when you're zayreya it, you will be zayreya it. You don't care. You'll zayreya it together with its klipa. What the pasuk is saying is that when you look at the chita, saira, and the adashim from a tumah perspective, you look at it. What's the oichel? What would you consider the oichel if you were being zareya? Not if you were eating it, even though we're discussing tumas oichlin. But it doesn't matter. How would I look at this oichel? What would be the chashi? What would be part of the oichel if I was being zareya? If I was being zareya, the klipa would be part of the oichel. I'm not going to remove the klipa before I plant this. It's part of it. If it's part of it with regard, that's ashay zareya. That's the Shulchan Aruch of what defines the oichel as it relates to the shir tumas oichlin. Very gishmak. And therefore we say that the klipas, which are the shaymrim and this sugya anyway. So the halacha is that they're mitzaref for this year. Now we're discussing tumas oichlin. That's what the pasuk is talking about. The pasuk is talking about an oichel where one of the shmoyne shratzim fell on it. That's good old fashioned tumas oichlin. So you see the klipas mitzaref. How do you know that this shaym not mitzaref for tumas chamura? The Tanu Rabban, we learned in the Brayso benevlasa. It says regarding the nevela. So that's the pasuk that discusses not the isra chila of nevela, but rather the tumah of nevela. And the pasuk says benevlasa v'loy ba'ar she'ein olav kazayis basar. As opposed to if somebody would touch the ar that doesn't have a kazayis basar, and it sounds like even if the ar is being mashlim the shir kazayis, but if you don't have a kazayis basar and you come in contact with the ar, no, it's hanegei. You have to touch the actual basar, not touching the ar. I would think if somebody touches the animal, it sounds like you're not touching the basar. I would think you're not tamei. So at the same time, you have a riboy that says kol hanegea benevlasa yitma. So nivlasa is a miyut, but yitma, the yud, should have said tamei. Yitma is a riboy. It says on my comment. How do you read this brayso? On my rav, this is the way you read the brayso. Benevlasa v'lor ba'or shein olav kazayis basa v'armashu lekazayis. The first brayso is coming to say that if somebody would touch an avela, he would touch a kazayis, but it's only kazayis together with the ar. Meaning there's no kazayis basa. Together with the ar, you have a kazayis. The halach is no tumah. That bin of loss is coming to be mine. What about if you had a kazayas passer and you now touch the ar? I would think that being that you touched the ar, you didn't touch the basar itself, you shouldn't be tamid tam. You shouldn't even look at the ar as a handle of this basar. So that say that through touching the ar, it's as if I touched the basar. That as it relates to that, it is going to be considered as if you touched the basar. In other words, what the Bryce is saying is two very important halachas, which is going to segue very much into tomorrow's stuff. And that is that the or of a nevela, on the one hand, is not considered part of the nevela with regards to tumah. On the other hand, it is considered part of the nevela as it relates to tumah. In the sense that it's not mitzaref to the shir kazayas, it's not considered part of the basar. Nevela has a shear. All tumah has a shear. So the shear of tumas nevela is a kazayas. What if I have less than a kazayas basar, but the is mashlim the shear kazayas? The halacha is you're not going to have tumas nevela. So the is not considered part of the nevela as it relates to being mitzdarif to the shear kazayas, but at the same time it is considered part of the nevela in the sense that if I have a kazayas basar anyways, and I don't need the to be mitzdarif the shear because it can't be mitzdarif the shear. But the question is, did I touch the basar or not touch the basar? If I touch it via the it's as if I touched the basar. So the first part of the brayso, the reish is coming to tell me that the is not mitzdaref. The second part of the brayso is coming to tell me that even though it's not mitzdaref, it's considered part of the nevela in terms that if I touch the without making direct contact to the basar, it's as if I touched the basar. The bottom line is we had a makar, we had two braisos. One braiso is a makar that for tumah kala, tumas oichlin, the halacha is that the shomer is mitzdaref, and I have another braiso that tells me that as it relates to the tumah chamur of tumas nevelas, the shomer is not mitzdaref. The pasuk that says I'll call zera that teaches me that when you're looking at tumas oichlin, what's the shear? The shear is what would be considered the oichel if you were coming to plant it, being that you plant it together with its shayrim, together with its klipa. The klipa is mitzdaref to the shear. At the same time, as it relates to tumas nevela, it says benevlasa v'loy ba'ar. Or is nismai that it can't be mitzdaref to the shear. Either way, this is very much a segue into tomorrow's stuff. So as it relates to raid, yesterday in a raid bite that we refer to as Coca-Cola Part 2, we discussed the history of the kashrus of gelatin, and to a much lesser degree, glycerin. At first glance, gelatin and glycerin, which are me'inyan le'inyan ba'isa inyan, in that they're both animal, non-kosher animal byproducts, you would think would be problematic because there's a general principle, anything that comes from a non-kosher animal is non-kosher. And based on that very, very broad 20,000 foot view, this whole discussion should really be dead on arrival. Stating that, we mentioned that there are two very strong svaras to potentially be mekel. Number one, the Ramah in Hilchas Basa V'Chalav, in Siman Pei Zayin Sif Yud, discusses a case where somebody took the keva, the abamazim of an animal, that was salted to the point that it got completely dried out. At this point, it's einay roy l'achilas ger. It's something that a person would not eat. Says the Ramah that it's mutter to go and be ma'arav it together with chalav, and you're not going to be over the issa basa v'chalav. The makar to this Ramah is a shibole aleket, but this is something that's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch by the Ramah. It would seem then that there's an idea that if you have machalos asuros that come to the point where right now they're in a roy l'achilas adam, that in and of itself would be a svara to say that maybe it would be mutter. Now, we mentioned that the Noda B'Yehuda in Yeridea, Kama, Siman Chavav, said a very important caveat, the not such fine print in terms of understanding this Ramah. The Noda B'Yehuda said that the Ramah brought this halacha dafka with regards to basa v'chalav, and the reason is because that keva that's being nesarav now with the chalav that's creating the machalos asuros woke up in the morning mitchilas priyasai, it was really regular kosher food, which means then that at the time that it's becoming aser, it's already in a state where it's eni roy lachilas adam. It could be it's then and only then that Ramah paskin that the halacha is it's not going to be a problem. If, however, you would have machalos asuros, nevela, a dag tame, something that came literally from something that's also, which woke up in the morning, mitchilas priyasa, it was already a problem. Now it became eni roy lachilas adam. Could be the fact that it later became eni roy lachilas adam is not enough to be mafkia it from its sister. So eni roy lachilas adam is a svara that says that it could prevent it from becoming aser, but it's not a svara to say that if it's already aser, it's not going to be mutter. The makar to this is Shitas Rameir in Masechtas Avodah Zarah, Daf Samech Zayin Amud Beis. Also Shitas Rabbi Yochanan in the world of the Noda B'Yehuda in Masechtas Bechoros Daf Chav Gimel, and the Noda B'Yehuda went to prove that we paskin like that Rameir, we paskin like that Rabbi Yochanan, and it's for that reason the Noda B'Yehuda said that this Ramah is a very important Ramah, but you have to use it responsibly. You can only invoke this Ramah, this Shibali Aleket, to the extent that the davar that is maybe becoming aser is in a state of Einei Roi L'Achilas Adam. But if you have something that was for sure aser, and now it became Einei Roi L'Achilas Adam, at that point, you wouldn't say that now it's going to be mutter. But we mentioned that despite the fact that Kfar Hoyer Zaken and the Noda B'Yehuda issued the psak that he issued, but it goes down amongst the poskim as a mechudesh dige psak, and there's definitely makim to be chaylik. Number one, because the Maggid Mishnah believed that the Shittas HaRambam is not like that Reb Meir that the Noda B'Yehuda based his whole tshuva on in Avodah Zarah Daf Ayin Zayin, but rather like the Baal Plukta of Reb Meir, which is Reb Shimon, the Rashba and the Rosh, both paskind like Reb Shimon, and you find already achronim that predate the Noda B'Yehuda, such as the Shvus Yaakov, the Chida, who was a contemporary of the Noda B'Yehuda, and later the Marsham, Reb Chaim Ozer. A lot of the Gdolei achronim held that as much as the Noda B'Yehuda said what he said, but as it relates to halacha, it's not something that we necessarily have to take on. But here's the point. The point is, there is an idea based on a Ramah, albeit with a whole tumult, that says that it could be once Machalas Asuros becomes Einei Roi L'Achilas Adam, at that point, this is not something that's going to be an issue anymore. Well, if that's the case, as it relates to gelatin and as it relates to glycerin, these are foods that were for sure once part of a non-kosher animal, but in the process of becoming gelatin and glycerin, in the process of becoming commercially viable, they certainly go through a phase where they're Einei Roi L'Achilas Adam. And based on the Ramah in Siman Pei Zayin Sefiyot, Deloika Noda B'Yehuda, there would be a very stark makom lahakal. That's the first svara to say that, even though you would think, what do you mean? It's made of pig skins. Why are we even having this conversation? The teretz is because Einei Roi L'Achilas Ger is a svara to potentially say that it's going to be mutter. The second svara gedoyla lahakal is Rabbeinu Yoina. The Rosh in Parakeitzim Avarchim Sechtes Brachos quotes Rabbeinu Yoina, who said gevaldige chiddush with regards to something that was commercially very much used back in the day, and that is there was a certain product called musk. Some people ate it, some people used it as an odor, a fragrance, a cologne, but musk was something that was very popular, and it came from a non-kosher animal, the musk deer, but it came from a non-kosher animal. And there was a big tumult whether or not you're allowed to eat, you're allowed to even smell this musk, or maybe not. And Rabbeinu Yoina issued a very important psak. He said that it's okay. And the reason is because from the time that the musk becomes commercially viable, it goes through a complete alteration to the point that it doesn't anymore resemble what it was when it was inside the guf of the non-kosher animal. And said Rabbeinu Yoina, there's a concept of panim chadashos bo kan, where we have a right to say that if something came from a davar aser, but it was altered to the point that it no longer resembles it, somehow it's nekar mishrasha, it uproots itself from its yichis, and we're no longer going to look at it as that davar aser. And it's for that reason, said Rabbeinu Yoina, this musk is something that's going to be mutal achila. We mentioned shock value. We mentioned that if you take a look at the Ramban in his Pirush al HaTorah, in the parsha of the Shemen HaMishcha, in Parshas Kisisa, where one of the simanim of the Shemen HaMishcha was the murderer. It was also one of the 11 samamonim that was inside the Ketores. And the Ramban brings that Hiskimu hamafarshim, that what was the mar of murderer? It was musk. And then he brings from Daven Ezra that said, what? They put musk on the mizbeach. The Ketores, the Shemen HaMishcha, is Kodesh Kodashim. If a person in his basement would go and try to replicate the Shemen HaMishcha, the Ketores, would be chayiv koros. So how in the world could you tell me that included in that was this musk that comes from a non-kosher animal, a proverbial gelatin? It's not even something you can fathom. How could it be? And the Ramban gives a little bit of an but we mentioned that really this shita of Hiskimu HaMefarshin, included in that is the Rambam. The Ramban himself quotes that it's the Rambam. And one of the people that had a major issue with this was the Ravid and the Kesef Mishnah on that Rambam. He's miyashiv based on the Svar Rabbeinu Yoina. He doesn't quote Rabbeinu Yoina, but he essentially says the Svar Rabbeinu Yoina. There's a panim chadashis bo'okan, and even though it's true it originated from a chayit mei, but right now it's already kosher, and if that's the case, there's no reason for this to be a problem. The point is, as it relates to gelatin, and again, glycerin, there's no question. They go through such rigorous chemical and acidic treatment, that it would be extremely, highly reasonable and rational to assume that the svara of Rabbeinu Yoina, as it relates to musk, would apply to this as well. Panim chadash is bo'kan. So it's true, it comes from a chazafisel. But at the end of the day, right now it's panim chadashes. And if right now it's panim chadashes, based on that, you would think that would be a very stark svara to be matter. So we have two svaras gedolos that we talked about yesterday that would lend itself to have maybe a conversation of a koyach dehetera, a pesach kechudei shel machat, that at least allows us to sit at the table and have an intellectually honest debate, whether or not maybe there's makom to say that what we thought is dead on arrival, gelatin and glycerin, treif on arrival, maybe really is not as pashut as we thought. Number one, because even if you look at it as tarfus, and even if you look at it as a chazer and an avela, but at the end of the day, it's einu roi lachilas adam. And if it's einu roi lachilas adam, well, that in of itself would be a reason for it to be mutter. Additionally, it could be that we don't even see it as chazer and avela, because being that panim chadash is bo'kan, so we look at it as a new entity, the fact that it originated from a davar aser, and even though kala yoytze mina aser. But once it's panim chadash and bo'kan, at that point, we're going to view it already different. That was really yesterday's shir, a tiny recap to segue into today's. Another big svara that the poskim talk about, if you go through the inyan, specifically of gelatin, is that a lot of gelatin was made from the bones of animals. And there's a big shaila in the poskim whether or not the atzamos of a non-kosher animal are asa b'achila or not asa b'achila. Meaning, you're not allowed to eat bas and avela. Are you also not allowed to eat the atzamos of an avela? You're not allowed to eat bas treifa. Are you also not allowed to eat the atzamos of a treifa? How do we view the atzamos of macholis asurais? The basar, ubasa basar, the treifa lo yisachelu. That we know. But the question is, as it relates to the atzamos, are atzamos aser or are atzamos mutter? The truth is that if you take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, and this is in Yeridea, this is in Siman Tzadik Test, these are literally the sugis that we were learning in Daf Yomi the last couple of weeks. So this is Sif Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Chatichas Nevela sheyesh ba basa v'atzamos. If you have a Chatichas Nevela that has meat on it, and there's also bones. That fell into a kedera of heter. Atzamos or iser, says the Mechaber, the atzamos of the nevela mitztarfim ima heter. The mitztarif, when you put them on the balance sheet, you put them on the heter side. Levatel ha iser. To be mevatel this. If ain't tzarich loimer, and it goes without saying, says the Mechaber, atzamos ha heter mitztarfim ima heter. Avol, says the Mechaber, hamoyach shabat atzamos, as relates to the moyach, the marich, the marrow that's inside that atzamos, that already of that Samis or Isser is mitzdaref in Isser. The Gufa Ktera, what about the Ktera? Ain't a mitzdaref, is loyama Isser v'loyama heter. But the Mechaber says that as it relates to that Samis of Isser, not only don't they count as Isser in the world of Bittul, but to the contrary, we put them on the other side. They actually count as heter. Says the Rama, v'yesh machmirim. There are those that are machmir, shalei l'tzaref, atzmois or Isser heter. There are people that are machmir, not to be mitzdaref, the atzmois or Isser together with the heter, Ubemakim hefsid, stating that, b'makim hefsid yesh lismoicha makilim umatirim kichein ikr. Because really the ikr is what the Mechaber said, and that is that the atzamos of Isser are really heter. So at first glance it would seem to be an often a Mechaber. That atzamos of macholis asuras are not even aser. There's no Isser in the world to go ahead and to eat the atzamos of an avela. Stating that, it's really, really not so pashut. And the reason is, because the Rambam in Hilchas Macholos Asuras, Perek Dalid, says that it goes through the different parts of an animal that are aser, in the event that this animal is aser, and he says as follows: V'treifa, oy mi behema v'chaya hatmeim. Right, so if somebody eats nevela treifa, you're not allowed to eat. Or you eat from a behema chaya tmeim, a non-kosher animal. Says Rambam as follows: Mina or, umina atzamos, umina gidim, umina karnayim, umina tlofim, umina tziparnayim. The halacha is, in all those situations, afal pishahu aser, even though what you did is aser, abahareza pater, you're not going to get malchus. Mipnei she'ein elu ru'uyin la'achila, because they're not roy la'achila, ve'ein mitztarf in abasal l'kazais. So says the Rambam, I have a list of body parts of non-kosher animals, be it nevela trefa, which is a kosher animal, but, or be it a legitimate bona fide non-kosher animal, pun intended, bona fide, as it relates to a non-kosher animal, where all these things are not included in the Iker Isser as it relates to Malchus, but at the same time they're going to be Aser. Again, what's the list? The the Atzamois, the Gidin, the Karnayim, the Tlofim, the Tziparnayim, all these things. Says the Rambam, Afal Pishahu Aser. Even though they're Aser, Abahareza Pater, you're not going to get Malchus. It's a Mefurish Rambam. The Rambam says it's Aser for a person to go ahead and eat the Atzamois of Isser. And really all the Gedolei Achronim ask, at first glance, it seems to be a stira. Mitzad echad, you have a halach in Shulchan Aruch, the Shitas HaMechaber, which usually follows the psukim of the Rambam, where the Mechaber says that when it comes to taruvos of Isser v'heter, the atzmos or Isser are on the heter side, and they're actually mitzdaref for all the heter inside the Ketera to go ahead and be mevatel the Isser, which would imply that atzmos of machalas asuras are mutter. Mutter midayraisa, mutter midrabanan. If they count as heter, that means they're 100% mutter. Yet the Rambam says Furish that afal pisha pater when it comes to that tamis, but at the same time it's going to be aser, which by the way could mean aser midayraisa, but for sure means aser midrabanan. How could the mechaber on the one hand, who goes b'darka shal Rambam, say that tamis so isner amitztarif the heter, yet at the same time, there's a Shitas HaRambam that says that if somebody would go ahead and eat that tamis, at that point it would be us. So if you go through the Gedolei Achronim, there are two Iker Mahalchim to answer this kasha. There's more than two, but there's two Iker Mahalchim. One Mahalach that the Gedolei Achronim said is that not all Atzamos were created equally. There are Atzamos that are mutter 100% to eat, even if it comes from a non-kosher animal or from a nevela trefa. And then there are Atzamos where Afal Pisha Pater, but at the same time it's going to be Aser. What's the difference? Are these Atzamois Yeveshois of the Haftarah fame? Or are these Atzamois Rakois? If they're Yeveshois, they're completely dry. They have nothing in them. They're just a dry bone. Those Atzamois are mutter lichatchila bein midayraisa, bein midrabanan, and it's those atzamois that the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tzadik Tes was referring to. When the Rambam says that afal pisha pater, but it's also to eat atzamois, he's talking about atzamois that are soft, atzamois that are on some level a little bit edible. And because they're somewhat edible, so it's for that reason those atzamois are going to be also, and that's what the Rambam was referring to. It's not a steer. The other primary mahalach in the Gedolei Achronim to answer this kasha is that from the fact that the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tzadik Tes says that the Atzamos, even of the Isser, count on the Heter side, that's a raya that when the Torah said Macholas Asuras Ha'aser, it did not include the Atzamos. So what then does the Rambam mean? The Rambam held the Svara. The Rambam held that the reason Atzamos are considered mutter is because nobody eats Atzamos. And because nobody eats them, it doesn't have a chashivas of oichel. So therefore, if you drop it in a kedera, I don't see it as oichel. I just see it as something that has the ability to absorb Isser. So therefore, I count it on the heter side. However, if a person takes an etzem and he bites into it, I enjoy the bone, right? If you're that kind of guy. Also, if you enjoy the bone, by you going ahead and biting into it, you're achsheve. You gave it a chshivas of oichel, right? That's the buzzword, achsheve. So to the extent that you go ahead and you're recognizing this as something that it's really not, that's something that in halacha very often you have the power, you have the ability to do. And it's for that reason, in that case, if you go ahead and eat it, it's going to be asa. So in the case where it just fell into a ketera, there was never an achsheve. If there was never an achsheve, so then the atzam is on mutter, and therefore it counts on the heter side of the ledger. If, however, you took a bite into it, that's what the Rambam's talking about in Perek Dal, Hilchas Macholas Asuras. So now you were just achsheve. Oh, to the extent that you went ahead and you were achsheve, so in that situation it's going to be different. In that situation it's going to be asa. A nafkamina in these two tzadim would be gelatin. So gelatin, as we said, very often was made from atzamos. Are atzamos aser or mutter? Meaning, forget about everything else. Forget einay roy lachila. Forget panim chadashas. Let's go back to its origin. The ikar underlying atzamos. These atzamos, are they aser or are these atzamos mutter? L'chura, it's totally really in this chakir. if you hold that the reason the Shulchan Aruch paskin in Siman Tzadik Tes that atzomis amuter. Hagam, the Rambam says in Perek Dal Hilchas Machalos Asuros that atzomis is aser is because the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam were not talking about the same atzomis. So when the Rambam says atzomis aser, he meant the atzomis harakos, and when the Shulchan Aruch paskin the atzomis amuter, he was talking about the atzomis yiveshes. Well, if that's the case, gelatin was made from atzomis yiveshes. And by the way, even though the atzomis that gelatin was made from could be originated as rakos, but once it becomes yiveshes, all the achronim nemdan, at that point it's for sure atzomis yiveshes, and for sure it would be included in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tzadik Tes, not in the Rambam Hilchas Machalos Asuros Perek Dal. But the bottom line is, so it's atzomis yiveshes. Atzomis yiveshes is going to be mutter. If, however, the chilik between the psak of the Shulchan Aruch and the psak of the Rambam is not of yiveshes versus rakos, but the chilik is, was it an achshave or was it not an achshave? So then there's a makom to say that if I'm taking these atzomis and I'm manufacturing them, I'm pulling out the collagen, I'm literally processing them in a way because I want to use them. So it could be or at the very least, that's an achshave. And to the extent that that would be considered an achshave, so then that atzomis al kapanim would be aser. But the bottom line is that this was another huge talking point in the sugya, specifically of gelatin, which very often was made from the atzamos. And there's an additional koyach tehetera, a third reason in terms of the way we're keeping score for why maybe the gelatin would be mutter. And that is, forget the fact, roy lachilas ger, any roy lachilas ger. Forget Rabbeinu Yoina's svar of Panim Chadashis Ba'okan. It could be there's a new time, a new reason why it would be mutter, and that is because if it's made from atzamos, assuming these atzamos had no basar on them, no skin on them, and they're 100% dry, when it comes to atzamos, there's a special koyach te'atera, and being that there's a special koyach te'atera when it comes to atzamos, again, totally in a little bit of ray, but at the very least, you can always turn to the Mechaber in Siman Tzadik Tes, Sif Aleph, that says atzomis hamuter. If atzomis hamuter, it's going to be okay. So again, what seemed like a conversation that should be done on arrival, and I'm pretty confident that if you ask the man on the street, is gelatin kosher or not kosher, he's going to say Chulin lo avekfendo, right? He's going to mamish. He's not even going to want to have a conversation with you. But really, la'achar ha'iyun, there's three klorim makomis that you can go to at the very least have an open, honest, intellectual conversation. Number one, the Ramah in Siman Pei Zayin Sif Yud. Number two, Rabbeinu Yoina, as quoted by the Rosh in Perek Ketzah Nevarchim, Panim Chadashis Ba'okan. And number three, the Mechaber and the Ramah, also to an extent in Yeridea, Siman Tzadik Tes Sif Aleph, and that is that atzamos are going to be mutter. Okay, so what's the bottom line? I think we did a lot of legwork, did a lot of divrei hakdama and divrei psicha. So what's the bottom line? When the poskim started seeing this shaila surface back in the day, how exactly did they go about it? So really, every good schmooze on the topic of gelatin has to start with Reb Chaim Moiser. So Reb Chaim Moiser, the great Vilna Litvische Goyen, Alpiv, all the yeshivas and all the whole Litvische world literally relied on 100% ad yoy moisay mamish. Reb Chaim Moiser wrote several tshuvas on the topic of gelatin. And you may be shocked to hear this, but Reb Chaim Moiser was a very vocal, a very adamant makel when it came to gelatin. No strings attached, no bal nefesh yachmers. He held it was 100% mutter, just to get a little bit of a feel of the way Reb Chaim Moiser went about the sugi of gelatin. So one of the tshuvas is in Chela Gimel, Shailas Tshuvas Achiezer. It's in Siman Lamed Gimel. It's Ois Hey. Reb Chaim Moiser was asked about this new patent, gelatin, that's being made from atzamos, and he has a whole opening paragraph in terms of the chemical processing that it's going through. And the shayl, the person who sent the shayla to Reb Chaim Moiser, he thought it should be mutter. So Reb Chaim Moiser writes back to him, he says, V'hinei, mailas k'vay teirasei helo lahate b'dvarim nechayim. He says that what you said, I agree with 100%. So what did he say? Al pi ma shekasav harama b'yeridei simin pei zayin siftes. Ba'oira keva. D'lefamim molchen oisayu miyavshin v'nasa ke'etz. He right away made a beeline to the Ramon simin pei zayin, and he said, what do you mean? It's any roi lachilas ger. So if it's any roi lachilas ger, based on that, it should be mutter. And Reb Chaim Moser writes back to him again, this is all what the Shoyl is saying, but he has the haskama of Reb Chaim Moser. Reb Chaim Moser likes it. He says, Helo lahate b'dvarim nechayim. The tzushal to the Ramah is a gevaldige tzushal. Then Reb Chaim Moser added, he said, V'lechayra, I think, ba'atzamois yeveshos, that when it comes to the ones that are made from datzamois, because that's what was described over here, assuming they yeveshos, which I know they are, ain't shum chashash. Then for sure there's no chashash. Do atzamois so isa mitztarfim in my head, levatolo isa kimavu b'yeridei, sim mitzadik test. Right? There's no question in the world that in that case it's going to be okay. If him came pashit atzamois and isyavshu ein b'em chashash is a klal. That as it relates to making it from atzamois, there's no question in the world that this in and of itself is not going to be an issue. One of the inyanim that Reb Chaim Moser addresses in this tshuva, he says maybe there should be a svara of achshaveh. Maybe once you decide that you want these atzamos, maybe it should be okay. So Reb Chaim Moser is not getting involved in how you meyashiv the steer between the Mechaber and the Rambam. But at the end of the day, Reb Chaim Moser throws out just as a svara unto itself. Maybe there should be enough. Achshaveh, said Reb Chaim Moser, he says that even though there is a concept of achshaveh and halacha, kol zeh ba'oichloi be'enei. That's if you eat it as it is. The sphere leid achshaveh, aval be'oisem mizeh avak dak l'tzoyrech hamada u'maymid bazeh. But if you're going to just take a little component of it and put it into a taruvos, and even then you're not putting it because you want to eat it. Gelatin doesn't taste like anything. You're using it because you want it to gel. That's literally what it's for. It's a davar ha'maymid. In a situation like that, ein bozeh achshaveh, it doesn't even fall into achshaveh. Ubeikar ha'ira hineni maskim imrum mailus kvoi teirasei lahakol bozeh. Reb Chaim Moser says, I'm maskim to you 100%. There's another tshuva. This one's in Chelik Dalet, also in Achiezer. This is in Siman Lamed Aleph. Now this is already a little bit different because over here the gelatin, quote unquote, wasn't being made from atzamas, it was being made from or. Or, even though that Rambam threw or and atzamas together, but or is actually a little bit more chamer than atzamas is. But the bottom line is this was being made from or, in which case it would be even a little bit more chamer. Either way, so the Shoyl again talks to Reb Chaim Moser, and he seems to know that Reb Chaim Moser is a big makel in this sugya. In fact, Reb Chaim Moser writes to him, he says, V'gam ra, he says, I see that you already saw my sefer Achiezer. Cheluk Yeridei Siman Yud Aleph, V'yodeya heichon daiti noite, and you know my take and my opinion as it relates to this whole inyan of gelatin. Now, one of the things that Reb Chaim Moser brings up in this tshuva that he doesn't mention in the previous tshuva is that there's a Ramah in Pei Zayin Yud with the Noida Behuda and all that raid. If you take a look at the Shach on that Ramah, the Shach says that mikomakim lechatchila, you shouldn't be soymach on that Ramah. It's enough in a Shach. So really, based on that, the whole Siman Pei Zayin Tzefiyud might be a shtickle dead on arrival because there's a Shach. Again, the Shach doesn't say it doesn't work, but the Shach says lechatchila, don't be soymach. So good. L'chatchila don't be samech, so l'chatchila find kosher jello or kosher marshmallows, kosher ice cream. I don't know. But based on that, maybe it's not something that's going to be okay. But Reb Chaim Moser says that don't worry about that shach. Don't worry about that shach. He says, you know why? Because take a look at the Pischei Tshuva. And the Pischei Tshuva brings from Rab Kiva Eger and from the Noida Yehuda that the only reason the shach said l'chatchila, it should be something that you should be nizer in, is because he was worried what would be if the keva wasn't 100% dried out. So then it would come lidei iser de'iraisa. But said Reb Chaim Moser, in all these gelatin cases, it would anyways never be an iser de'iraisa because it's always going to be bottle be'etzem. And being that it's never going to come lidei iser de'iraisa, so Reb Kivega and Reb Yehuda already had that caveat on the shach that said you don't have to be worried l'chatchila. And based on that, this is not something that I'm going to worry about. Says the Reb Chaim Moser weiter, last paragraph. Umasha kosav Yehuda. He says, what about the Noida Yehuda? You're probably wondering, I'm in all my tshuvas referring to that Ramah and Siman Pei Zayin, Sif Yod. And I'm even getting added a shach. But what about the Noida Yehuda? Noida Yehuda said it only worked by Basa V'chalav, where the keva was mutter. So once it's already in a right lachilas ger, it can't become aser. But if something was aser meikar, based on Shitas Rameir and Avodah Zarah Daf Samach Zayin that we spoke about for a half hour yesterday. So says Reb Chaim Moser, Uma shekasav Noida Yehuda do Isser loy nifka. Chalak olav b'seifa Tiferes Tzvi huva b'pischei tshuva sham. The Tiferes Tzvi was already chaylik, as the Pischei Tshuva quotes. V'chein b'darkei tshuva shehevi mishar mechabrim. Darkei tshuva to some already brought from other mechabrim that were chaylik. V'gam b'shar iser, and he says besides by other. Even basar iser, kol shenesyavish nifka ha iser, v'akapana benidin didan shenesyavish al yedei pu'uloi shoynos. But he says besides over here we already had pu'uloi shoynos, v'al yedei hachimya. Chemically, it was already altered. I think in this situation, even the Noida B'Yehuda is going to be Moida. You know why? Because it's Panim Chadashnis. K'moshe Kosavti B'Chiyaz Hashem. V'yesh laharich b'chol prat u'prat. Avur ritzoyne shel adam zeh ukvoidai. V'rum ma'alos kvoid terase bikesh me'iti leheshe b'ktzara. So I'm telling you to b'ktzara, gelatin is kosher. So really, the aviyah makilim, as it relates to being soymech on the kulas of gelatin, was none other than the great Litvische Goyin Poisek Hadar, and that is Reb Chaim Moiser. Another one of the very important makilin in the sugi of gelatin was the Gaivet of London, Talmud Muvik Reb Chaim Brisker, another one of the great Litvische Goyinim, the author of the Chazon Yecheskel on the Tosefta, Hagoyin Hagadol, Reb Chatzkel Abramsky. He too wrote a tshuva. Now it's interesting, the tshuva that Reb Chatzkel Abramsky wrote was written to Reb Eliezer Waldenberg, the Baal Tzitz Eliezer, and it's printed in the Hakdamah, the Chelik Dalit of Tzitz Eliezer. Now he starts off as follows. It's very interesting. He says, Davar Barurhu, Asher Hagelatin Hanasa Me'atzamois, Eino Yetzira Chadasha. It's borrowed to me that the gelatin that is made from atzomais is not a new creation. That you could say that it's right, panim chadash is ba'okan, that it's something completely new. The gelatin, who oisay chaymer atzmois sheyeshnoi ba'atzomois be'ikron. Because the way I see gelatin, said the Chazon Yecheskel, is that really it's included in the atzomois originally. The cholam tzoim hakimiyim, all these chemicals that are added to it, shemishtamshem betasnias ha'gelatin, einam ba'am elo lahafrid shar hamorim sheyeshnoi ba'atzomois mechaymer ha'gelatin shlei yafsidu what shlei yigru asibay. I don't think this is Panim Chadasha, says Reb Chatzkel Abramsky. Because in my opinion, the way I see the gelatin is that whatever is there, the collagen, it was always in the atzamas. And really all the chemicals are doing is just separating. They're not transforming, they're not creating, they're not physically or chemically altering. What they're doing is just separating. They're taking something that was balua, so to speak, and being muffed with it. So now all of a sudden, it's not going to be part and parcel. Umemela says the Chazon Yecheskel, Ein kan mokoim lemasa umatan beheter agelatin anasa matzomis avel sutrevus al pi divrei Rabbeinu Yoina shenafa by chaticha shel iser hetika rosh perkates mevarchen simul lamed. So it's not a tzushtal to Rabbeinu Yoina zok the Chazon Yecheskel, stating that stating that I think it's mutter anyways. Mitam shoatzomais inam bechal nevelu treifa v'tmeil le'inyan iser kishem she'inam bechal nevelu le'inyan tuma v'sholish rayis mechiches ken, and he goes ahead and he writes a whole tshuva. So says Reb Chatzkel Abramsky, even though I don't think the panim chadashes svara is a tzushel over here. He didn't get involved in the Noida B'Yehuda. But as it relates to Rabbeinu Yoina, that one of the three svaras that we mentioned, I don't think is a tzushel. But at the same time, as far as I know, the gelatin's being made from atzamas. Now again, not all gelatin was made from atzamas, but a lot of it was. And the ones that are made from atzamas are mutter, and the reason is because atzamas are mutter. And then he writes a whole langa tshuva, and the upshot of the tshuva is that it's mefurish in the mechaber that atzamas are mutter. The Rambam, again, he has a whole pilpul. But the way he answers the kasha is, it's not shver. Because the Shulchan Aruch was talking about atzamas rakos, and atzamas yeveshes, and the Rambam was talking about atzamas rakos, and gelatin is made from atzamas yeveshes, and based on that, it's an offer on Allah and Shulchan Aruch that it's going to be mutter. And don't tell to that Rambam, and he has again a whole tshuva on this. But the bottom line is, he comes out halacha l'maisa it's mutter. Then at the end he says that, I'm just a little bit nervous because I'm hearing that a lot of people think that it's really aser, and they can't fathom, they just don't understand how something like this could possibly be mutter, and they're making a big tumult. This was going on in America big time, and these rabbis, they're corrupt, and they're on the take, and someone's paying them off. Right? There was a lot of this stuff that was going on back in the day. Ayin Sham or don't be Ayin Sham. But the bottom line is, he says, so based on that, it could be there's like a svara to be machmer. He says, but you want to know what I think as far as gelatin goes? It's one 100%. There's no question in the world. I think that this is something that's going to be mutter. Another tshuva that I think that's worth referencing is a tshuva that was written by Hagoyin Hagadol, the Gaivid of Yerushalayim, Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank. And this is printed in Shailas Tshuvas Har Tzvi. It's in Yeridea. It's in Siman Pei Gimel. The name of the tshuva is Glida Shema Arvin Ba Gelatin. So this is ice cream that they mix together with gelatin. And the Har Tzvi, if you go through his tshuva, made. By the way, listen to the shaila that was even asked. Kedai. Bidvar haglida hanim keres b'mekoymoy shema'arvim ba avak gelatin. So I'm talking about different ice creams that are sold, and these ice creams are made with the dust, avak gelatin. V'choymer zeh, ready? This choymer, where does it come from, this gelatin? Nasa miragle chazirim. It comes from chazafisel, literally. I mean, this is the question that was presented to the Tzvi. It comes from the ragle chazirim, v'oiroi seyem, v'oiroi sa'golim ba'oifen zeh, and he goes on to explain how they convert it from literally a pork chop, all of a sudden, to suddenly going into your kosher ice cream. It's mind-boggling. But this is the way the Har Tzvi goes ahead and he sets it up. And says the Har Tzvi, to me, I'm going to tell you what it's telling you. This is the way I see the sugya. To me, there's a Ramah in Sim Pei Zayin Sif Yud. He talks about the of the cave that became 100% oisketricken, and he says the halach is it's mutter. And even though the shach says lechatchila, but I'm not worried about that. But the bottom line is, that's to me what it's telling. Narvas. My promise is the Noida B'Yehuda, because the Noida B'Yehuda held that you can't be soymach on that, because the Noida B'Yehuda said it's only true by the keva, which is mutter. So now that it's kates, maybe it can't become asa. But something that was the asa meikara, like the chazafisel, so maybe it has no way of becoming mutter, even if later it becomes the eneroy lachilas ger. So said the Har Tzvi, really, it's up to you. You want to be machriel lahakil the loika Noida B'Yehuda? I'm not so comfortable saying that, because really it comes down to this shaila: are you going to take on the Noida B'Yehuda and Yeridei Simcha Chavav, or are you going to go like many other poskim? By the way, one of the poskim that a lot of the poskim held was chaluk the Noida B'Yehuda. They had a raya from a shach in Simon Kuf Yudal. We didn't talk about that yesterday, but it could be the shach is also on the ledger of chalkum on Noida B'Yehuda, which would bolster that other side big time. But the bottom line is, it's a big machlokes Noida B'Yehuda and his chalkum, and it's not something that I'm so comfortable getting involved in. And then at the end he says, but I would just look into one more thing, and that is, this whole shail of the Noida B'Yehuda is where it's eneroy lachilas ger. To the extent that it becomes eneroy afilu lachilas kelev, that's clear in the sugya of avodah zarah and in b'chayros, then it's already less. He says, to me it sounds like this goes through a phase where it's not even roy lachilas kelev, and to the extent that it's not even going to be roy lachilas kelev, at that point I think it's going to be even more kuladik. So he says, I don't know, I'm not in a position now to have the time to look into this, but he tells the shayl, find out, and he says you can do it with timas kfela or timas kelev, right? Go ahead and find out. See if a dog would eat it. If a dog would not eat it, then it would be eneroy lachilas kelev, and then even like the Noida B'Yehuda, this is a whole nother angle, that even like the Noida B'Yehuda would be mutter. Bottom line is, again, Reb Tzvi Pesach was approaching it with a koyach de'atera, again, assuming you're willing to go away from the Noida B'Yehuda. But the bottom line is, again, the idea here is just to get a little bit of a time what's going on. B'chaim was all in lahakal, all in. B'chatzkal Abramsky's being mekel mitzad the atzamos. That was his big svara to be mekel, which would only help you for the gelatin that's made from atzamos. Reb Tzvi Pesach thought that, eneroy lachilas ger, if you're willing to go the loika Noida B'Yehuda, that would be a svara lahakal. And in his mind, it's ganzi yutachin, this is eneroy lachilas kalev. In which case, this is 100% going to be mutter. But the bottom line is, we just mentioned three of the biggest poskim of all time that for sure had a koyach de'atera as it related to the entire sugya of gelatin. The truth is, if you go through all the poskim, you'll be shocked, you'll be stunned at how many poskim held that gelatin was mutter. It's a Hall of Fame list of Gedolei HaPoskim. Fast forward to more contemporary times, the definitive tshuva lahakal that was written on this topic was written by Rabbi Vad Yosef, and that's the tshuva that we referenced yesterday. It's in Shailas Tshuvas Yabia Omer. It's Chelik Ches, Yeridei Siman Yod Aleph. Anyone that's interested in being Tein L'Chacham Yech Gemayt on this topic should go through that tshuva from the first word until the very last word. And one thing that you're going to see over there is that Rabbi Vad Yosef was mekel, and the way he sets up the tshuva is really the way we set up these raid bites. We plagiarize. It's the way we set up these raid bites. And that is, there's three svaras gedolos to go ahead and to be mekel. Number one, there's the Ramon Pei Zayin Yud. Number two, there's Rabbeinu Yoina. And number three, there's Atzomas. And in the world of Rabbi Vad Yosef, it was check, check, check. He held that all three tainas were 100% mutter. Everything is mutter. He held the Nid Yehuda, it's Pasha, we don't paskin, like 4 pages proving that we don't go like this Nid Yehuda. He held Rabbeinu Yoin, there's no Shaila in the world. He brought from the Knesset G'doyle and the Radvaz and G'doyle Apoiskim that all went lahalacha with this Rabbeinu Yoin. And as far as Atzamas goes, it was Pasha to him that Atzamas is not a problem. By the way, one of the tainas that Rabbi Yosef says that's so sharp, he says that, as it relates to Atzamas, there are people that say, how could you be soymich on gelatin and Atzamas based on the Mechaber and Simon Tzadik Tes? It's a Mefurish Rambam, Perik Daled, where the Rambam says Atzamas are aser. How in the world could you be making on that? It's the Mefurish Rambam that says that it's aser, right? It's a Mefurish Rambam. So we said 2 different eitzes, and maybe that's Chaps and Afkamina. Rabbi Yosef says Hafla Vela. He says it's Pasha to me the Olam made a tois. He said I don't think the Mechaber, right? Is there anyone who understood the psychology of the Mechaber better than Rabbi Yosef in the last 100 years? I don't think anybody. So Rabbi Yosef says, let me tell you what the Mechaber was doing. He wasn't passing like the Rambam. He knew the Rambam's not like him. He was passing like the Rashba. He says the Rashba in Teres Abayah says Bok Tzena, that Atzamas are always mutter. It's a Mefurish Rashba. The Rambam steht nicht da so in the yad. Oh, but the Rashba says, he says everybody made a toys because everybody thought that the Mechaber always goes with the Rambam. So maybe there was a stira, and nobody wanted to take on this halach and Shulchan Aruch without recognizing there's a Rambam, and that's why there was so many Pulpulim, and a lot of these Pulpulim ended up aser. And based on that, you're going to have a problem. Achshavei, all these different svars. Because I hold it's a toys made kara. The Mechaber never meant the Rambam. Et Ebege meant the Rashba. And then he has in parentheses a whole arichas where already the Yoidei Dover of the Mechaber knew that very often the Mechaber meant the Rashba, not the Rambam. This is not just a gelatin ha'ara. This is Negeya Bechlal, all the Mechabers. But the bottom line is he never meant the Rambam. It Ebege meant the Rashba. And he said if that's the case, it's an off and a Mechaber. I don't even know what you're talking about. Shulchan Aruch Paskin. So you're going to go Keneged. The bottom line is Rabbi Vad Yosef goes, he's Mekel all over the place, and this is the last line of the tshuva. V'chein ikar lahalacha ula maisa, that it's mutter v'nirli niyas daiti kosafti. Now Toich Dvarav in the tshuva, he says Yedidi Hagoyin Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, he was also Mekel. And there's a Gillian here that was written by Rabbi Vad Yosef. This is a little number, and the last line of the tshuva. V'chein helo lahakam b'shaylos the tshuva is Evan Yisrael chel ches simen nun vav ayin sham. This is Rabbi Vad Yosef writing. Who's the Evan Yisrael? Who's Evan Yisrael? It's Rabbi Yisrael Yanke Fisher. He was also Mekel. So you have Rabbi Vad Yosef in more contemporary times, and you have the Tzitz Eliezer in contemporary times, and you have Dayan Fisher in contemporary times, and they were all Mekel. An incredible koich dater. And Rabbi Vad Yosef's kula is a flat-out kula. It's an all-encompassing, all-inclusive kula. On the Reb Chaim Moiser level kula. So it's a Dover Pella, right? Because no one in the world, there's no mainstream kashrus organization that would even entertain giving a hashgacha on gelatin. There's no, in the world of controversial kashrus topics, this is the Avia voice. Reb Chaim Moiser, Reb Chatzkel Abramsky, Reb Hersh Pesach. I mean, for sure, Reb Chaim Moiser, because that's an all-encompassing heter. And then there's a whole list of who's of Gedolei Apoiskim that held it with mutter. And fast forward to Chacham Ovadia and the Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Yisrael Yanke Fisher. And they all went ahead and were Mekel. So what's going on over here? How did gelatin become such a problem? Where did it come from? So the short answer is, you know where it came from? It came from 2 American Go'onei Gedoylei Olam that were very, very machmed Indian of gelatin. It was Rav Moshe Feinstein and it was Rav Baron Kotler. And they held very, very strongly that gelatin is aser, and it's because of that the OU v'chulei went ahead and they were machmer. And by the way, these chumras of Rav Moshe and Rav Baron go back. The Ramoshes Chuvas are 1950s, 1960s. They go back a very, very long time. I mean, this is, early stage American Jewry in terms of, the way it developed to where it is today. And already at that time, when Ramosha was writing Chuvas that people said he didn't really mean, but he was only doing it because, of the American Jews, it was at that kufa that Ramosha was being machmer on gelatin. And Rab Aaron was machmer on gelatin, and it's really based on that the American kashrus organizations go full stop and say that it's problem. But the question is why, right? I mean, how do you make sense of it? At the end of the day, there's 3 very compelling arguments to be made to say that it should be mutter. So why have such a koyach the Isura, right? I mean, where's it coming from? So let's see. I mean, as it relates to the Ramah in Pei Zayin Yud, so you could always argue that there's an Oida B'Yehuda, right? You could always say there's an Oida B'Yehuda. And being that there's an Oida B'Yehuda, so based on that, we're going to argue that it's not so pashut that you could stelzu. So that's Pshat and Ramosha. That was Pshat and Rabbaran. They held that they didn't want to go to Loika and Oida B'Yehuda. The Reb Chaim Oizer was willing to go to Loika and Oida B'Yehuda. The Marsham was willing to go to Loika and Oida B'Yehuda. Rav Tzvi Pesach is open to the possibility of going to Loika and Oida B'Yehuda. Chacham Avadia, Rabbi Yisrael Yankel Fisher, Ditzitz Eliezer, they're willing to go to Loika and Oida B'Yehuda. And this is what it boiled down to. No jello for you because I'm not willing to go to Loika and Oida B'Yehuda. Is that what's going on over here? Is that what's going on over here? So the emphasis, if you go through the tshuva from Ramosha, and by the way, Ramosha never wrote a full tshuva on gelatin. There's some hack on this, but Ramosha never, you have to speak to the Yoda Dover. Ramosha never wrote a proper tshuva. He throws it in I saw 3 places, where he just, like, B'derech Agav, oh, by the way, Al Dvar gelatin. But you would have thought that, I mean, we have tshuvas on sherry cask and a chalav stam, and mamish, everything that was very important at that time. There was a reason the Yoda Dover claimed that Ramosha did not want to write a tshuva against gelatin. Again, this is way beyond the scope of this year. But the bottom line is that but in those tshuvas, there was a svara that Moshe said, and really Reb Aaron and his Mishras Reb Aaron spoke about this tshuva as well. And this is a very, very big svara. The svara is that the whole premise of the Ramah in Pei Zayin Yod is that if you have oichel that becomes any roy lachilas ger, so there's mokum to say that now it's going to be mutter. What happens if that oichel goes from any roy lachilas ger, now it's roy lachilas ger again? What happens if whatever had happened to it that caused it to be any roy lachila was suddenly undone? Would that change anything or would that not change anything? So the truth is, there's a Chavas Das, where the Chavas Das said that it's still going to be mutter. But the Meister of Aaron has a whole arichas. They didn't want to be soymich on this Chavas Das. And based on that, it could be this whole Noida B'Yehuda doesn't really start. Because even though it's true, it started being any roy lachila, but now it's an ingredient. So now it is roy lachila. So if right now it's roy lachila, so it could be based on that. It would be hadar dina. You would have to treat it like regular machalas asuras. In fact, Ramosha adds one knech. I'll read it inside. And this is in Yeridea. It's chelik beis. It's simin chav gimel. Aval yesh lodem mitam achad. Fi masha amar denasu in roy lachila shalochein avshe mitzad habasar atzmoi im nasa in roy lachila vu basar iser loy hayinu matirin. If you would have basar iser that became in roy lachila and now it's going to be used as an ingredient, I wouldn't be matir it. Why not? So you'll say maybe the Noida B'Yehuda. No, it doesn't say the Noida B'Yehuda. Mishum de'ulai. Kivan shemat shenivsol me'achila hu mitzad hachanosam bazel lo'oichol yoyser tov ke'agelatin. Because why does it become any roy lachila? It's dafka. You're making any roy lachila. It's not because it's sat in your backyard, through a boiling hot summer, June, July, August, and now all of a sudden no one's going to eat it. No, you did it there, bedafka. You did it because you wanted it to be any roy lachila, so now you should be able to use it in a way where it's going to be roy lachila. In a situation like that, this was Ramosha's greatest fight. And really, Ramosha and Rabbaran, they both held very stark that even though at one point there was any roy lachila, but now all of a sudden it became roy lachila again, and being that it became any roy lachila, once it's hadar dina that it becomes roy lachila, at that point it's not going to be. What about Rabbeinu Yoina? Right? Rabbeinu Yoina says panim chadash is bokan. That's maybe already a different thing. Has nothing to do with any roy lachila, right? We spoke about the distinction between those two svaras. What about Rabbeinu Yoina? At this point it's a panim chadashes. So Shamati, I didn't see this inside, but Shamati that the Machmirim said that it could be Rabbeinu Yoina is not a tzushtal, because Rabbeinu Yoina was talking about a case where the panim chadashes was into a davar mutter. It went from being a davar also to a davar mutter, like the chatichas basar that fell into dvash. So it started off basar and now it's dvash. But to the extent that this new thing that it became is not an inherently davar mutter, it's the same chazafisol, narvas. It looks different, it was chemically altered, but it didn't proactively mefurish become a davar mutter. So maybe in that situation, it's still going to retain its issur. Maybe you're not going to say panim chadashes. We had Reb Chaskel Abramsky, who said his reason why he doesn't think this Panu Chadash is. By the way, we mentioned that Shuv for Reb Chaskel Abramsky is in the Hakdam at the Chelik Dar of Tzitz Eliezer. The Tzitz Eliezer has Hagoyis on Reb Chaskel Abramsky's Shuv, and he says he doesn't hear it at all. He says, I can't imagine that the chemicals and the acid that's added to gelatin is any less than whatever happened to the musk in the case of Rabbeinu Yonah. But Al Kopanim, there is maybe a shtickle svar, and as it relates to the Atzamos, here the Olam held very, very strongly. They held very strongly to be machmer. Just read to you for a Moshe's Tshuva. This is also in Chelik Beis in Yerdei Simcha of Zion. This is the last paragraph. Gelatin anase mi oiros behemis tmeis unevelos v'treifes yesh lesar. The isuri ikka ba'oiros ve'atzamos ukedoimer av shepotik et isa b'ramam perak dalid machol sasurus halach yudches shekosav afal pisha hu aser reza potter aber umemela aser, and being that it's aser gamma gelatin, and everything's going to be aser. Rabbi Aaron in his Mishnah, Rabbi Aaron felt very strongly that way. It's actually interesting where Rabbi Vad Yosef says that he believes that the Mechaber was coming not from the Rambam Bechlal, but it was coming from the Rashba. So he actually quotes Rabbi Aaron. And he says that, Rabbi Aaron, if you go through his Chuvas, it's in Mishas Rabbi Aaron, Chuvas Mishas Rabbi Aaron. It's a Chelik Aleph, Simen Tez Zayin, Simen Yud Zayin. Very long, not easy Chuvas, Kedarkish Rabbi Aaron. So it's very, very long and hard Chuvas. But Lamaisa, Ruba the Ruba of the Chuvas, busy with the Atzamas. And Avad Yosef's Lashon is, Va'anod da Amri, b'mechilas k'foy teirasoi, loy zochar sar. The sar he's referring to is Rabbi Aaron. Loy zochar sar, divrei harashba, b'teiras habayis, u'b'mishmeres habayis, asher negidim Yedaber she'ein ba'atzamis atzman shum iser v'utanu polagal divrei harambam desmir le'sheish iser midrabban ba'atzamos u'maron zal holach be'kfoisav k'dekaimelon halacha k'basroi, and then he brings all the marmakoimis where the Rambam very often does that. So where the Mechaber very often does that. But Al Kopanim, when Rabbi Vad Yosef said what he said, he was talking to Rabbi Aaron. He said Lo Zocher Asar. He wrote two long tshuvas. He never mentioned there's a Rashba who's a Tanu Polag and the Rambam, and it was Pashmi. That's what he was going like. But here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that gelatin, it starts off dead on arrival. Or, like we said, treif on arrival. But really, it shouldn't be so pashut that it's treif, because you have three svarus gedolos maybe to be mekel. Number one, you have the Ramah in Sivan Peizayin Sif Yud, that once it's Eineroi Lachilas Ger, at that point there's a Koich Te'atera. You have Rabbeinu Yonah that says Panum Chadash is Ba'okam, and to the extent it's made from Atzamois, you have the Mechaber in Sivan Tzadik Tes that says that Atzamois of Macholas Asurois go on the Heter ledger. And really, it's based on these three svaris that there was a lot of tumult amongst the Gedolei Achronim and a lot of Koich Te'atera. Chaim Moses seemed to invoke all three of these kulas, and really, fast forward 50 years later, Rabbi Vad Yosef did the same thing. You go through the tshuvas from Gedolei Achronim. Some invoked all three, some invoked some invoked one. But at the end of the day, there was a tremendous koyach te'atera on something that you would think should be treif on arrival. Ubesoicham Reb Chaim Moser, ubesoicham Reb Chaskel Abramsky, ubesoicham Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank, Reb Avad Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, Rabbi Yisrael Yanke Fisher. You had over here Gedolei Achronim that had a koyach te'atera, stating that really there's mokum lefakfik on everything as it relates to the Ramah and Peizayin Yud. I mean, number one, there's a Noida B'Yehuda. Number two, the Shach says l'chatchila, this is not something that you should be soymech on. And then there's the greatest svar of Ramosha, that it could be that even though it was Einei Roy L'Achila, but now that it's Roy L'Achila again, maybe it changes. And certainly, being that your intent was, to make a Roy L'Achila. What about Panim Chadash's Bo'kan? So if you go through the Paiskim, number one, mentioned yesterday, the Rosh was Mefakfek on Rabbeinu Yonah. So there are those that say that even though, Rabbi Vad Yosef with his Bekiyas was mine of all the Paiskim that went with this Rabbeinu Yonah, maybe Rabbeinu Yonah is not 100% oiskalt and la'alacha. It's not so clear. You have the Svar of Chatzkel Abramsky, the other Svar that we said that maybe only when it's nishtana to something that's mefurish mutter, as opposed to it's the same thing, it just was altered, and it's Panim Chadash's Ba'okan. And as it relates to the Atzamos, even in the case of Atzamos, there is makom to say that at the end of the day, the Rambam says Atzamos are aser. And that's what Moshe said, that's what Rabbi Aaron said. At the end of the day, Atzamos are aser. What do you mean? You want me to go connect the Rambam? Vad Yosef said a nice shtickle Torah, the Mechaber meant the Rashba. Maybe they mean the Rashba, maybe he meant the Rambam, and maybe he's being Machriya, and maybe it's totally an Achshevei, and now you have the Achshevei. So because at the end of the day, there was Faras Lakan, it's not so posh that that's the way it should be. And really, the American Poiskim, Uberoshim, Ramosh, Rab Aaron, they held very much Lahachmer, and the Kashrus organizations go based on that. Either way, this is a little bit of a two-part synopsis of the sugya of kosher or non-kosher jaltan. But what does that have to do with Coca-Cola? Right? I mean, today's is Coca-Cola Part 3. We didn't even mention Coca-Cola yet, I don't think. So what does all of this have to do with Coca-Cola? So I'll tell you something very interesting. I was talking to Rabbi Bienenfeld last week, and he told me that, we spoke about how the Welt is under the impression that the first person to ever give a proper hashkach on Coca-Cola was Reb Tuvia Geffen. In fact, Reb Tuvia Geffen goes down in history as the Coca-Cola rabbi. And in Atlanta, Georgia, 1935, he's the first person to go and to give this hashkacha. But we mentioned that's not true, because in 1931, Rabbi Bienenfeld Zayda, his namesake, Rabbi Bienenfeld, right, already was making it not only kosher, but even kosher lePesach. So, was Rabbi Bienenfeld the first person to ever give the hashkacha on Coca-Cola? The truth is, before Rabbi Bienenfeld gave the hashkacha, there was another big Rav that gave a hashkacha on Coca-Cola, and that is Reb Shmuel Aaron Halevi Pardes. So, who is Reb Shmuel Pardes? So, Reb Shmuel Pardes was a European Goyen who came to America in 1924. When he came to America, he settled on the Lower East Side. He was a Rav there in the Montgomery Street Synagogue for 3 years. And then in 1927, he left New York and he went to Chicago. Now, Rav Shmuel Pardes was a great European Goyen, but he was famous for his circular, his journal, that he was the editor-in-chief of, and that was the Hapardes Journal. Now, it's interesting. The history of the Hapardes Journal goes back already to Europe. Pre-World War I, a very young Rav Pardes was already, very entrepreneurial in terms of going out and having this journal where there was a lot of vikuchim back and forth. It was a good moneymaker, too, because there's a lot of advertisements in it. So this was a good geschäft. But the bottom line is, this was something that he was already doing pre-World War I. But then it came to a crashing halt, and it stopped circulation for over 10 years. But when he came to America and he settled in Chicago in 1927, he reinvigorated. He brought it back to life. And this time he did it with a whole new cast of Rabbanim. It was all the American Rabbanim and the Gedolim in America. They were all very, very involved and very influential, contributing articles and going back and forth and discussing different things in the Hapardes Journal. So I'm going to read to you from an advertisement in a Hapardes journal, and this is from 1930. Rabbi Bienenfeld showed me the original. I just took a picture of it. So this is how it starts. Verstehe Kadas. Sounds familiar? Trinken is allemal gesinnt. Drinking Coca-Cola, again, Kuf Aleph, Lamed Aleph, is avade gesinnt. Es ist nicht du kein bessere Maschke wie Coca-Cola. Es macht euch frisch in Minter, I'm not sure what Minter means, lebendig in energetisch. Okay, I guess it gives you energy. I think that's what it means. I'm skipping the next line because I'm going to botch it. Wilt ihr nur haben Zimmerzeit von a gitten geschmacken Getränk? Nitz Coca-Cola. Is auch kusher, by the way? That's a good thing. In irgendwelchen Chash, wie ihr kommt in candy stores, in restaurants, in drugstores, not drugstores, but right, without going there, this is just gelatin. Drugstores, food it, a bottle Coca-Cola. So because you walk into a drugstore, or you walk into a restaurant, or you walk into a candy store, you should ask for a Coca-Cola. This is the advertisement. Then there's a little box, and listen to what Rabbi Pardes writes. Bizman ha'achroin. Recently, Bikarti es Pesach HaRoshes Harashi shel Coca-Cola ba'Atlanta shel Georgia. So I was mevaker, I visited Coca-Cola in Atlanta, Shell, Georgia, right? Atlanta, Georgia. Vehema Bali Pesach HaRoshes, and the Chevra there, the chemists, Gilu Lefanai Kol Talumois. He said, they revealed to me all the secrets. Va'af Taruvas, this is one of the greatest puns of all time. Va'af Taruvas Hasoidi. The Taruvas of the soda. He writes in parentheses, secret, right? Soda. So the side of the soda. Hakol Chokarti Ubadakti Umatzosiv Ki Amashke Coca-Cola Kosher Lishtois Alpidin Shmuel Aaron Alevi Pardes Oirech Umoitzel Oira Pardes. So Pardes already wrote in 1930 that 5 5 years before Geffen, he was already inside the Beis HaCharosh of Coca-Cola, and they were Megala, the side of the Soda to him. They were Megala to him exactly what's going on in the Coca-Cola, and he says, you have nothing to worry about, it's kosher. But here's the kasha, it wasn't kosher. There was glycerin inside. Because that for sure we know from Rabbi Geffen. So how was he machshir it? So what was going on over here? So Rabbi Bienenfeld said, I don't know. But it's very, very possible. And this I do have. There's a sefer, it's called Avnei Shmuel. The sefer Avnei Shmuel was written by Rav Shmuel Pardes. He was a goy in Olam. He contributed heavily to his own journal. And we have a sefer from him. It's called Avnei Shmuel. And in Avnei Shmuel, there's a section called Birurei Halacha. And in Birurei Halacha Siman Yotes, it's B'Shelas HaKashrus Shel Gelatin. He writes a tshuva on gelatin. And if you go through the tshuva, it feels so much like Chacham Avadia's tshuva. He goes with the Noid Yehuda and the Panim Chadashnis, and he says to him it's mutter. As a matter of fact, in the back of this sefer Avnei Shmuel, there's a whole kuntris. It's called Kuntris Be'inyan Shelas HaGelatin Lo'ira Alacha Me'ezer Rav Simcha Elberg Shlita. Today is the Chroin Levracha. So Rav Simcha Elberg took over the Pardes after a Pardes was nifter, and he was very involved in Kashrus Kiyudua, and he wrote a whole kuntris with regards to gelatin. And like Rav Pardes himself, he was a very, very big makel. As a matter of fact, in the Hakdama to the Sefer Avnei Shmuel, he has a collection of tshuvas, a small collection of tshuvas that Gedolei Olam wrote him. And one of these tshuvas were written, Mechtav Me'agoyin Reb Chaim Moiser Grudzinski, Zechet Tzadok Levrach, Mechaber Secher Av Chiezer, El Agoyin HaMechaber, Be'inyan Shelas HaGelatin, Shedon Ba'agoyin HaMechaber B'Sifrei L'Kamam B'Midas Birei Halacha Siman Yotes. After Rav Pardes sat down and he wrote his tshuva about gelatin, he sent it to Reb Chaim Moiser. And Reb Chaim Moiser wrote back to him. And Reb Chaim Moiser wrote back to him, and it's printed here. This is not printed in Achiezer. This is printed in one place, in Avnei Shmuel, because it was a custom letter that was sent by a goy and a gadol, Reb Chaim Moiser, and it was sent to Reb Pardes. And he tells him, I went through your whole shaila. It's actually interesting the way Reb Chaim Moiser starts. Michtavav higiyuni b'moyadam yachadem zeh kibalti akuntris v'dvar minei hagelo asheyesh by taruvas gelatin v'chein minei ice cream. This is Reb Chaim Moiser talking. Asher nimtzem taruvas the gelatin u'mevar barucha ifanei hamalocha avoida. But at the end of the day, he says, I'm maskim to your tshuva. And when you went ahead and you said that it's mutter, this is something I'm maskim to 100%. Said Rabbi Bienenfeld, it's ganz yitachin. It's ganz yitachin that the reason that Rav Pardes was matter wasn't so much, was based on the fact that, what's the issue? There's glycerin inside? Okay, so there's glycerin inside. Glycerin is like gelatin. Now, it's not mamish the same as gelatin. So again, we have to make this disclaimer over and over and over again because, I feel the blitz coming. But at the same time, again, obviously gelatin is different. Gelatin very often was made from matzamos. This is made from basar. This has a taste. Gelatin doesn't have a taste. There are chilukim. But at the end of the day, if you go to the core principles of the gelatin tshuva, the first two core principles, which are the Ramah and Siman Pei Zayin and Rabbeinu Yoina. So at the end of the day, if there's a svar of Einer Roy Lachilas Ger and there's a svar of Panim Chadashos Ba'okan, Mali gelatin, Mali glycerin. And based on that, it's so clear a Pardes held glycerin was mutter, or at least gelatin was mutter, that said Rabbi Bienenfeld, it's not rachik to say that the reason he went ahead and he was matter was based on the fact that what you're dealing with over here is something that's anyways mutter. If you're dealing with something that's mutter, it shouldn't be a problem. This was Rav Pardes L'Shitosai throughout his Sefer Avnei Shmuel with the haskam he had on his tshuva from Agoy and Agadol Reb Chaim Moiser, which was really the opinion of Ruba the Ruba of Deli Yisrael back in the time, and that is that it's mutter. So if it's mutter, it was basically, he said, who cares? I saw this glycerin. So what? Glycerin is mutter. So if glycerin is mutter, it's not going to be an issue. In other words, just to come full circle, just to tie rate bites 1, 2, and 3 of Coca-Cola together. We mentioned Rav Tuvia Geffen came and he got access through Mr. Harold Hirsch, Ashkacha through Ashkacha, to the ingredients of Coca-Cola, and he said, there's glycerin over here. Riboyna da Almakula. This is going to be a huge problem. And even though it's 1,000th of the entire Taruvas, but there's a Rashba, and even though the Noid Yehuda said, but I don't care, you can't go Keneged a Rashba. And based on that, the Shulchan Aruch brings the Rashba, and there was no way he was allowing this to go through, and there was no way he was going to be Mekel. But we said that Rabbi Bienenfeld before him was Mekel. And now we're saying that Rabbi Pardes even before him was Mekel. Where were they coming from? So Rabbi Bienenfeld said that he had a Messiah from his Zayda, that it's a Noida B'Yehuda. He was being Soymech on a Noida B'Yehuda. Which Noida B'Yehuda? Noida B'Yehuda that says that if you have a little bit of Isser inside Heter, where it's Batal B'Shishim, even if it's Darkoi B'Kach, and even though the Rashba said where it's Darkoi B'Kach, there's no Heter, and even though the Shulchan Aruch Kuf Lamed Dalet said that where it's Darkoi B'Kach, we paskin like this Rashba. But at the same time, the Noida B'Yehuda said, Kedai, Hey, Harambam, V'Rabbi Ari Magash, Lismach Aleim. And we spoke out with Tosaf from Moshe and his Tshuva to the Gaibet of Elizabeth, Rav Pinchas Taitzach, that it could be, it's because the Shulchan Aruch only brought this halacha in Hilchas Yain Nesach Vakerd, in Hilchas Chemes Akim, over there like Noida B'Yehuda was Meichiach, the Shulchan Aruch paskin, not like the Rashba. What's the Hilchas Yain Nesach in the Sugi of Taruva? Sometimes even eat Shisha, it's way more Chamer. And it's because of that he went and Mekel. So what was the Svara to Rabbi Binefel was being Simcha when he was Mekel? It's a Noida B'Yehuda, Yena Noida B'Yehuda, and Yeridei Madura Tinyana Simen Unva. Where was Rapardas coming from? He was coming from a whole other angle. Could be you're right as it relates to the Rashba, and it could be it's not kedai to be soymech on that Noida B'Yehuda. It could be you're right. The sensitivity of saying that if it's darke bekach, we're not going to go ahead and be mekel. But we're not dealing with macholos asuros, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with glycerin. And glycerin, like gelatin, there's makim lahakel. And you know why there's makim lahakel? Because you can go to Loika Noida B'Yehuda. You can go not like the Noida B'Yehuda. But the bottom line is, so you had over here the Coca-Cola rabbi, who goes down as the rabbi that was not the Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was mutter before. It was mutter before Rav Tovia Geffen. It was mutter in 1931, we know for sure, by Rabbi J.B., Rabbi Yaakov Binefeld. We know that it was mutter in 1930 by Rav Shmuel Pardes, as mentioned, Vashtia Kadas. Ashtia Kadas. Not only is Coca-Cola gezinnt, but it's kosher ochet. It's also something that's kosher, and it's something you can find in the candy stores, the restaurants, and the drug stores. Wherever you go, this is something that you're going to be able to find. But the bottom line, this is before it had real Coke in it, by the way. You were buying it. Anyways, but after, I should say. But the bottom line is, that might have to be edited. But here's the bottom line, that we have over here Sai, Rabbi Binefeld, and we had Sai Rabbi Pardes. They were both being mekel, but at the end of the day, they weren't being mekel for the same reason. It could be Rabbi Binefeld was being mekel from the Noida B'Yehuda. He was being mekel because glycerin. Two Sfaris Lamhakel. At the end of the day, I think this just brings out the legacy of Rav Tovia Geffen that much more. Because at the end of the day, Rav Tovia Geffen, when he went ahead and he changed the recipe of Coca-Cola, he was mamish making it that Coca-Cola, Kuf Aleph, Kuf Aleph, Kuf Aleph, Lamed Aleph, should be Al Tyrus HaKodesh. He wanted it to be Al Tyrus HaKodesh. And there should be no glycerin. We shouldn't have to be soymech on all the tshuvas that glycerin is kosher. And it shouldn't even have to get involved with Noida B'Yehudas and bittles. At the end of the day, why should you have to be soymech on bittel? He wanted that it should be rain. It should be 100% Vashtia Kedas, which, by the way, wasn't just a game changer as far as Coca-Cola goes, but it was a game changer in terms of the way American Rabbanim were going to view kashrus. This is a young America where things are evolving very, very quickly, and there's going to be commercial kashrus organizations. And what is the hashkafa going to be? And Reb Tovia Geffen set it on a path where it was going to be 100% al Tyrus HaKodesh. In the 1930s, in the spiritual world that America was at the time, it wouldn't have been so rachik to be soymech on a tshuva from the Poisek Adar Reb Chaim Moser, and it wouldn't have been so rachik to be Poisek on a tshuva from the Poisek Adar 150 years earlier, the great Noida B'Yehuda. Shem Yu Kol Chachmei Yisrael B'Kaf Echad. Van Noida B'Yehuda on the other kaf, he's Machriya School. And Afilu Hachi, Reb Tovia Geffen had this hergish, he had this sensitivity. A Litvish Yid, at that point, an elder Litvish Yid living in Atlanta, Georgia, and he says, we're going to make Coca-Cola Tyrus HaKodesh. Very much changed the landscape of how kashrus would be treated in the United States of America. Either way, this concludes Coca-Cola Part 3.